Part 1. The Crossing, 1620s, 1640s. The year was 1628, and the grey skies over Plymouth, England, carried a damp chill that seemed to seep into the bones of anyone who dared linger too long at the docks. Among the scattered crowd of passengers, traders, and seamen stood a young man of 22 named Thomas Whitfield, clutching a small wooden chest that contained all he could truly call his own. His clothes were plain, patched at the knees and elbows, and though his frame was lean from years of farm labor, his eyes burned with the kind of restless hunger that only comes when a man feels trapped by the land of his birth. England to him was no home anymore, but rather a cage of poverty, of rigid class, of a church and crown that demanded obedience without question. He had listened in the taverns to the fiery sermons of Puritan preachers, who whispered of a new life across the ocean. In a land wild and untamed, where a man might live according to his conscience and reap the fruit of his own toil. And so, with trembling hands, Thomas signed his name to a contract of passage on a crowded merchant vessel bound for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, knowing he might never again see the green hedgerows of his childhood village. The ship that carried him, the Providence, was not a grand vessel of war or a sleek trader, but a weather-beaten cargo ship pressed into service for carrying those desperate enough to risk the Atlantic. Below deck, the air stank of damp timber, salt, and the bodies of men, women, and children packed into bunks, little larger than coffins. Rats scurried freely, and the constant heaving of the sea kept half the passengers sick and groaning. Thomas quickly learned to sleep lightly, his chest serving as a pillow lest some desperate soul try to steal from it in the night. The voyage stretched on week after week, storms battering the ship, waves crashing over the deck, while crewmen cursed and lashed ropes with bleeding hands. Some nights the wind howled so fiercely that Thomas lay awake, certain the ship would splinter and send them all to the bottom. Yet through it all, he held fast to the dream that on the other side of this endless sea lay freedom. There were moments of strange beauty too, glimmers that remained etched in Thomas's memory for the rest of his days. Once, as dawn broke over a calm sea, he saw dolphins leaping alongside the ship, their sleek bodies cutting arcs of silver through the waves as if guiding them westward. Another time, when the sky cleared after days of storms, the sailors pointed out the strange constellations unseen from English shores. For Thomas, who had never traveled farther than the nearest market town before this journey, it was as though the very heavens were expanding before his eyes. The sea was vast, terrifying, and wondrous all at once. But the crossing was not without its toll. Sickness spread quickly among the passengers. A child no more than 6 years old died after a week of fever, her mother wailing as sailors consigned the tiny body to the sea. Another man, raving with illness, leaped overboard in delirium, vanishing beneath the gray waves before anyone could cast a rope. Thomas learned then what it meant to face death not as an old man after years of comfort, but as a shadow that stalked every step of life. He clung tighter to his faith, reading by the faint glow of a tallow candle from a small Bible he had inherited from his father, its pages worn but precious beyond all measure. After 10 long weeks at sea, when despair had nearly settled into the hearts of the passengers, the cry came from the lookout. Land. A ragged cheer erupted from the deck as all rushed to catch a glimpse. There it was, dark forest stretching to the horizon, a rugged coastline, and smoke rising faintly in the distance where small settlements clung to survival. This was not the gentle countryside of England, with its farms and villages long since tamed. This was something older, wilder, vast beyond imagination. Thomas's heart pounded with both fear and awe. The New World. Landing at Salem, he quickly learned that survival here demanded more than dreams. The colony was still young, struggling with poor harvests, disputes with native tribes, and the ever-present fear of hunger and disease. Thomas, unaccustomed to the brutal winters, worked where he could, hauling timber, digging ditches, and helping to raise crude wooden houses that leaned precariously against the wind. Food was meager, and more than once he went to bed with nothing but a crust of stale bread in his stomach. Yet, unlike in England, his work here mattered. No lord claimed the sweat of his brow, no overseer dictated his every move. Here, if he survived, he might truly make something of himself. In time, Thomas joined with other settlers to claim a small tract of land farther inland, near the edge of dense forests that seemed to whisper at night with the cries of unseen creatures. It was back-breaking work felling trees, burning stumps, and turning wild soil into fields. Alone he would have failed, but the settlers relied on each other, sharing tools, food, and protection. Over long months, Thomas cleared enough ground to build a rough cabin of logs, its roof thatched with reeds. It was no manor, but to him it was a castle his own, one with his own hands. Not all encounters in this new land were welcome. The neighboring native people, wary of the growing settlements, sometimes came to trade furs and food, but relations were strained. Thomas remembered one bitter winter night when a raiding party attacked an outlying farm, burning barns and killing livestock. Fear swept through the settlers, and for weeks they posted watches at night, muskets ready. To Thomas, who had grown up with little more dangerous than a fox raiding the henhouse, it was a grim reminder that this land was not theirs alone, and that every inch of it was contested with blood. Yet, despite the hardships, life pushed forward. In 1632, Thomas married a young woman named Margaret Ellis, herself the daughter of a family who had braved the crossing years earlier. Margaret was strong, her hands hardened from farm work, her voice steady even in the face of hardship. Together, they raised a small home, and in the years that followed, children filled it with laughter. The first winter of their marriage nearly claimed them when a storm collapsed part of their roof, and Thomas worked through the night in freezing wind to keep the fire from dying. Margaret held their newborn close, whispering prayers. By dawn, their survival felt like a miracle. Seasons turned, years passed, and slowly a community grew where once there had been only wilderness. Fields spread outward, corn and beans growing where forest once stood. Livestock multiplied, and small roads began to connect the scattered homesteads. The settlement held meetings in a simple wooden church, where voices rose in stern hymns and prayers. Thomas, who had once been a restless young man with little more than hope, stood among elders, his calloused hands testimony to decades of toil. Yet even as prosperity inched forward, challenges never ceased. Crops failed in drought years, wolves prowled the edge of their land, and rumors of new conflicts with native tribes stirred unease. Thomas learned to measure wealth, not in coin, but in survival. Another winter endured, another harvest gathered, another child grown strong. By the 1640s, when gray streaked his beard and his back ached with the labor of a lifetime, he would sometimes sit outside, his cabin in the evening light, watching his children play in the fields he had carved from the forest. He thought then of that storm-tossed voyage across the Atlantic, of the hunger and fear of the friends lost to sickness and sea. Was it worth it? The answer, he believed, lay in the sight of his sons chasing fireflies under a sky vast and free, and in the quiet strength of Margaret beside him. For though this land was hard, it was theirs, and that, to Thomas Whitfield, was freedom worth every price. So the first chapter of the Whitfield legacy was written, not in ink upon parchment, but in sweat upon soil, and in courage upon the unknown. From a restless young man on the shores of England to a patriarch in the wilds of Massachusetts, his journey was but the beginning of a saga that would span generations, shaping and reshaping with the tides of history. The crossing was done, but the true test of endurance had only just begun. Part 2. The first winter, 1640s-1660s. The autumn of 1641 settled over. Massachusetts, with a fiery beauty that seemed almost cruel in its promise for the settlers, knew too well that such brilliant colors of red and gold were but a warning of the bitter months to come. By now Thomas Whitfield had carved a life from the wilderness, but he understood the danger that winter held. He had seen families starve when harvest failed, and he had buried neighbors who succumbed to cold and fever before the thaw of spring. Though his own homestead had grown stronger, fields plowed. A barn erected, children sturdy and quick, he could not shake the gnawing anxiety as the days shortened. Survival was no longer about a man alone, as it had been on that first Atlantic crossing. Now it was about those who depended on him. His wife Margaret, his sons John and Samuel, and his daughters Anne and Mary. Their lives, their laughter, their very breath were tied to his ability to provide. The Whitfield farm, modest though it was, had become a center of resilience in the growing settlement. Thomas had learned much in a decade on American soil, some through bitter trial, some through wisdom gleaned from neighbors and even cautious exchanges with nearby native people, corn, beans, and squash. The three sisters taught by the tribes had become staples of their diet, supplemented by pigs, chickens, and what game could be hunted in the forest. Yet every year was a gamble. Some seasons the earth gave richly, others it withheld without mercy. That year, blight had touched the cornfields, leaving the harvest smaller than hoped. Thomas stored away every ear of corn, every dried bean, every smoked strip of venison, knowing it might not be enough. By December, snow lay deep upon the ground, piling against the log walls of their cabin, turning paths into icy trenches. The wind whistled like a predator through the cracks, and no matter how many logs Thomas stacked upon the fire, the cold seemed to creep into their bones. Margaret wrapped the children in layers of wool. Her own fingers cracked and bleeding from the endless work of spinning, mending, cooking what little could be spared. Nights were the hardest, when hunger stirred and the wind screamed outside. Thomas would lie awake, listening to the coughing of his youngest daughter, fearing that fever might come for her in the night. There were nights when he rose from his bed and stood in the doorway looking out across the moonlit fields, the snow glistening under stars sharper than blades. He thought of England then, of green fields and hedgerows, of warmth beside the hearth of his father's cottage. And then he would remember the chains of poverty that had bound him there, the endless bowing to lords and bishops, and he would turn back into his cabin, gripping his musket as though to remind himself of what freedom required. America did not give life easily, demanded a price in sweat, blood, and sometimes lives. Yet it gave something greater in return, the chance to be master of one's own fate. The first winter in their cabin tested that promise. When food ran short, Thomas and his eldest son John, now a sturdy lad of 12, set out into the forest to hunt. They tracked deer through deep snow, their breath rising in white clouds. For days they returned empty-handed, the woods silent and cruel. Then one morning, as dawn broke pale and brittle, John's arrow struck true, felling a lean deer that stumbled into the drifts. They dragged it home together, their hands numb, their hearts soaring with relief. Margaret wept with joy as she prepared the meat, and for a time the family's hunger eased. That kill, small though it was, may well have saved them from starvation. Yet winter did not relent. Sickness swept through the settlement, fever burning through homes, claiming young and old alike. The Whitfields prayed nightly for protection, and though 2 of their neighbors perished, Thomas's family was spared. He tended the sick when called, bringing what little herbs and remedies Margaret knew. And in return, the community stood by him when his own children fell ill with coughs and chills. In such trials, the settlers learned the meaning of fellowship, for alone no man could stand. By the time spring thawed, the snow and rivers swelled with melting ice. Thomas emerged from that brutal season older in spirit, though not yet old in years. He bore new scars, hands rougher, face more lined, eyes more watchful. But his family had survived, and in survival lay victory. As green shoots pushed once more through the soil, the Whitfields planted anew, this time with greater wisdom, greater caution. They had learned how much to store, how much to trade, how much to risk. Each year thereafter carried its own trials, but none quite so sharp as that first winter in their cabin. It had nearly broken them, but instead it had forged them. The decades that followed saw the Whitfield name grow in strength within the colony. John and Samuel matured into men, taking up their own plots of land, while Anne and Mary grew into women who would marry and carry the family line into other households. Thomas himself became something of a patriarch within the settlement, known for his endurance and his steady hand in disputes. Though he never sought leadership, his neighbors often looked to him when quarrels arose over land boundaries or questions of law. He spoke plainly, without flourish, but with a fairness that earned respect. It was in the 1650s that the colony itself began to change. More ships arrived from England, carrying not only hopeful settlers, but also those sent against their will-indentured servants. Orphans and criminals given the choice of exile over prison. The population swelled, farms spread deeper into the wilderness, and with that expansion came greater tension with the native tribes. Thomas, now gray-haired and slower in step, warned often of the dangers of arrogance, reminding younger men that the land they plowed had been lived on long before their coming. Some listened, others scoffed, eager to claim more acres. When skirmishes flared, Thomas grieved, for he had seen enough of hunger and death to know that both sides would pay dearly. Through these years, the Whitfield homestead endured, weathering storms both natural and human. There were times when crops failed, when wolves stole into the pasture, when sickness claimed infants before they could walk. Each loss cut deep, yet each season of renewal gave new life. Margaret's hair turned silver, her hands knotted with years of labor, but her spirit never faltered. Together, she and Thomas would sit by the hearth in their later years, watching grandchildren play on the cabin floor, marveling at how a journey begun with so much uncertainty had blossomed into a legacy. By the 1660s, Thomas was an old man by the standards of his day, his body bent from decades of toil. He often spoke to his children of that first winter, reminding them that survival had been earned through sacrifice, faith, and the stubborn refusal to yield. Never forget, he would say, voice gravelly but firm, that this land was not given to us. We carved it with our own hands, and we hold it only so long as we are willing to fight for it. His words, though simple, carried weight, and they would echo in the generations to come, long after his bones rested in the frozen soil of New England. Thus, the first winter became more than a memory. It became a lesson, a cornerstone of the Whitfield legacy. To endure hardship, to cling to faith when the night was darkest, to bind family and community together in the face of despair, these were the truths that carried them forward. And as the colony grew, as whispers of new conflicts and new opportunities stirred, the Whitfields stood ready, their roots deep in the soil of a land that had once nearly destroyed them, but had instead become the foundation of all they were. The story of America was still young, and so too was the Whitfield saga. Their survival through the first winter was but a prologue to the storms that history would yet bring, storms that would test not only their endurance, but their very souls. For the wilderness was vast, and the century yet long, and destiny had only begun to shape its hand upon them. Part 3. Seeds of a Nation, 1670s, 1690s. By the year 1672, the settlement where the Whitfields had once carved a home from the wilderness had grown into a bustling town. Its dirt roads pressed firm by the wheels of carts, its meeting house, rising like a sentinel at the center, its fields stretching wide where forest had once stood. The children of Thomas Whitfield now stood as men and women with families of their own, and the Whitfield name carried weight among the colonists of Massachusetts Bay. John Whitfield, eldest son, had taken the homestead after his father's passing and had expanded the farm into one of the largest in the district, his barns filled with wheat, rye, and barrels of salted pork. His brother Samuel had moved further westward, taking a plot at the frontier where the forest pressed close. His life rougher, but his independence fiercer. The Whitfield daughters had married into respectable families, weaving bonds of kinship that gave the clan influence in matters both civic and sacred. Yet with growth came new trials, for the land was not without memory, and the people who had dwelt there long before the English did not yield their ground lightly. It was in the summer of 1675 that the storm broke, a storm not of rain but of blood. The Wampanoag Sachem Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, rose in resistance against the encroachment of settlers who cut deeper into native lands year by year. What began as scattered raids flared into full war, a brutal conflict that engulfed the colonies of New England, known later as King Philip's War. It was among the most devastating struggles of the century, its flames consuming towns, farms, and lives without mercy. For the Whitfields, it became a crucible that tested their survival and forever changed their view of this land they called home. John Whitfield, now a man of nearly 40, was among those who took up arms when the alarm was raised that neighboring villages had been attacked. He had never sought battle, his life spent behind the plow more than the musket, but necessity called. With his eldest son, Thomas the younger, at his side, he marched with the town's militia, leaving behind his wife and younger children with prayers that they would remain safe. Samuel, living further west, found his homestead caught directly in the path of raids. One night, he and his wife barely escaped with their lives as flames consumed their barn, their livestock slaughtered or stolen. They fled eastward, their faces blackened with soot, their eyes hollow from terror. The war left no family untouched. Battles raged through forests and along rivers, ambush and counter-ambush staining the soil red. Entire settlements were wiped from the map, their inhabitants killed or taken captive. For the settlers, who had thought themselves secure after decades of toil, it was a sobering reminder that the land was contested at every step. John fought in skirmishes where the smoke of musket fire mingled with the cries of men and the wails of women. He saw comrades fall, scalped, and left upon the field, and he hardened himself with the grim knowledge that survival demanded ruthlessness. Yet he also saw the cost on both sides: native families driven from their villages, hunger gnawing at them, just as it did the colonists. War was not glorious, he came to understand, but a grinding devastation that spared none. When King Philip himself was killed in 1676, the war at last waned, though its scars remained for generations. The Whitfield farm, though spared the torch, bore losses nonetheless. Fields left unplanted in wartime meant lean harvests. Samuel, his home destroyed, came to live with John for a time. Their families crammed together under one roof, every meal stretched thin, yet through perseverance and stubborn labor, they rebuilt. Samuel in time raised a new home further east, choosing caution over the raw edge of the frontier. John's children grew into adulthood marked by memories of fire and fear, their innocence stolen by the war. The years that followed, though less violent, were not without turbulence. The colonies expanded rapidly, drawing more ships each year from England. With them came not only settlers, but goods, fashions, books, and news from across the Atlantic. The Whitfields, though farmers, were not untouched by this flow. They traded surplus grain for tools of finer make, purchased cloth dyed in colors their grandparents had never seen, and heard tales of distant wars fought between kings and empires they had never met. It was a strange existence, at once rooted in the soil of New England, yet tied inexorably to a distant mother country. Religious life remained at the heart of the community, and here too the Whitfields played their part. John, though never a preacher, was a deacon in the meeting house, his stern face often seen in the front pew, his voice steady in the psalms. Margaret, his wife, was known for her kindness, tending the sick and comforting widows. Their home became a place where disputes were settled, travelers welcomed, and orphans taken in. Through such acts, the Whitfields gained not wealth of gold, but wealth of respect, which in that Puritan society mattered as much. By the 1680s, a new generation of Whitfields came of age. Children born in the New World who knew nothing of England, save the stories of their elders. Thomas the Younger, named for his grandfather, grew into a man restless with ambition. Unlike his father John, who was content to till the soil, Thomas sought broader horizons. He spoke often of Boston, where trade and ships bustled, and of opportunities to profit from commerce rather than farming alone. Against his father's wishes, he apprenticed himself to a merchant, learning the art of trade, bookkeeping, and negotiation. Though John grumbled that such pursuits smacked of vanity and risk, he could not deny a spark of pride when his son returned with coins in his purse and tales of dealings with men from distant ports. The seeds of change were being planted, not only in the Whitfield family, but in the colonies themselves, as commerce and ambition began to rival piety and simplicity. The 1690s brought yet another trial, this one of a different nature. In the town of Salem, not far from the Whitfield farm, hysteria swept through the people in what became the infamous witch trials. Fear, suspicion, and fervent belief in the devil's work consumed neighbors, tearing communities apart. Accusations spread like wildfire, and those once trusted found themselves in chains, accused of sorcery. The Whitfields, though spared direct involvement, watched with horror as men and women were hanged on little more than rumor. Anne Whitfield, daughter of Samuel, was among those who spoke against the madness, insisting that too many innocent lives were being cast aside. Her courage earned whispers of suspicion, but her steadfast faith shielded her from greater danger. To the Whitfields, the trials were a bitter lesson in how fear could corrode even the strongest bonds of fellowship. Through all these upheavals, the family endured, planting, harvesting, marrying, and burying, as all families must. By the turn of the century, the Whitfield farm was no longer the crude log cabin of Thomas the Elder, but a sturdy homestead, its fields wide, its barns tall, its hearth warm. Generations had been born and raised within its walls, each carrying forward the memory of hardship and the hope of better days. The seeds sown in toil, watered with sweat and sometimes with blood, had begun to grow into something greater than any one man. For the Whitfields, the 1670s through 1690s were years of testing and transformation. They had survived a war that nearly erased the colonies, endured the madness of suspicion that turned neighbor against neighbor, and navigated the slow shift from frontier farmers to participants in a broader Atlantic world. The nation yet unborn was stirring in its cradle, shaped by conflict, faith, and ambition, and the Whitfields, like countless other families, were the roots from which it would grow. The story of America, still fragile and uncertain, was being written in furrows of earth, in the crack of muskets, in the prayers of the faithful, and in the restless dreams of a new generation. For every field sown, every child born, every risk taken, the seeds of a nation were planted. And as the century drew to its close, the Whitfields stood ready to reap both the blessings and burdens of the harvest to come. Part 4. Shadows of Empire. 1700s, 1720s. The dawn of the 18th century found the Whitfield family firmly rooted in New England. Soil their name now spread across several towns, their lineage stretching into a third generation born beneath the hard sky of America, rather than across the sea in England. To the grandchildren of Thomas the Elder, England was little more than a distant word, a place spoken of by their fathers in hushed tones around the fire, but no more real than the stories in Scripture. They were Americans before the word carried its later weight, children of a land both harsh and fertile, bound to it in a way no king across the ocean could fully grasp. Yet even as they plowed fields, built barns, and raised their families, the shadow of empire stretched long across their lives, reminding them that they were not wholly free. At the start of the century, John Whitfield's eldest son, Thomas the Younger, had left the farm to pursue trade in Boston. By 1702, he was a man of some standing, dealing in timber, salted fish, and barrels of grain carried by ship, 2 ports in the Caribbean. His success brought him wealth greater than any Whitfield before him, but also entangled him in the complex web of empire. Every cargo he shipped, every coin he earned, was taxed and regulated by the Crown's mercantile system. The Navigation Acts, designed to ensure England profited from colonial trade, chafed at him. He watched as goods that might fetch high prices if sold freely to Dutch or French merchants were instead seized or heavily taxed unless routed through English ports. Yet, like many traders, he learned to skirt the rules when he could, striking quiet deals with captains who turned a blind eye for their share of profit. Smuggling became not an act of rebellion in his eyes, but a necessity, a way of survival in a system designed to keep colonists subservient. Back on the Whitfield farm, now overseen by John's younger sons, life continued much as it always had. Seasons turned, crops were sown and harvested, families grew. Yet even the quiet farmers could not remain untouched by the empire's reach. Taxes increased, demands for militia service echoed whenever wars flared between England and France, and goods that once arrived freely became scarcer, more expensive. When King William's War and then Queen Anne's War raged in Europe, their effects rippled across the Atlantic. Raids by French and native allies threatened frontier settlements, and colonial militias marched off to fight battles that most farmers scarcely understood. Wars begun by kings thousands of miles away, but paid for in the blood of their sons. It was during Queen Anne's War, beginning in 1702, that the Whitfields once again found themselves drawn into conflict. Samuel's eldest son Daniel, a youth of 18, joined the militia, eager to prove himself. He marched northward to the contested borders of New England, where raids burned villages and gunfire echoed through forests. Letters home told of cold nights, scant rations, and sudden attacks from the shadows. When Daniel returned 2 years later, leaner and harder in spirit, he carried with him the haunted silence of one who had seen too much. He spoke little of what he had endured, but his eyes, shadowed and restless, told stories enough. The war had ended with treaties signed in Europe, but in New England, the memory lingered, a reminder that peace was fragile, always at the mercy of distant monarchs and their ambitions. As the decades passed, the Whitfields adapted to the shifting tides. Thomas the merchant grew wealthy, his ships reaching farther each year, his household adorned with imported wares that astonished his farming kin. He dressed in fine coats of wool and silk, his children educated by tutors, his name whispered with respect in Boston taverns. Yet with prosperity came unease. He saw firsthand how the crown tightened its grip, how customs officers prowled the docks, how men whispered of bribery and corruption just to conduct honest trade. He began to question in his private journals whether a people so far removed from England could truly thrive under its rule. His words, though penned quietly, echoed sentiments that in time would roar across the colonies. Meanwhile, on the farm, the Whitfield descendants endured the endless labor of tilling soil, battling drought, flood, and pests.
Ow.
Their lives seemed far removed from the politics of trade and empire, yet the undercurrents touched them too. Prices for goods fluctuated with wars they had no part in. Debts grew when merchants raised costs. And sermons from the pulpit often turned to warnings of corruption, vanity, and the temptations of wealth. Puritan fervor, once the beating heart of the colony, had begun to cool, yet its stern legacy still shaped their days. The meeting house remained the center of life, its bell calling them to worship, its elders guiding their conduct. To be a Whitfield was to be bound by both toil and faith, the weight of legacy pressing upon every choice. By the 1710s, a new restlessness stirred among the younger Whitfields. Sons who had grown weary of plowing fields dreamed of trade, of land further west, of fortunes yet to be made. Daughters, once resigned to the narrow paths of marriage and household, whispered of education, of learning beyond the Psalms and Catechism. The world seemed to widen with every ship that docked at Boston, carrying not only goods but ideas. Pamphlets and books from England spoke of philosophy, of liberty, of science challenging tradition. These ideas spread slowly, like seeds on the wind, but they found fertile soil in young minds, hungry for more than survival. In 1720, John Whitfield, the elder, son of Thomas the Pioneer, passed from this life at the age of 86. His funeral drew kin from across the colony. Dozens of Whitfields gathering to honor the man who had shepherded the family through decades of war, famine, and growth. As they stood by his grave, the younger generation looked upon one another and saw how far the family had spread, how strong its roots had grown, yet they also felt the weight of the world shifting around them, a sense that their lives were entwined not only with the soil beneath their feet, but with forces across oceans. The Whitfield saga by the 1720s was no longer merely the story of survival in a harsh wilderness. It had become the story of a family caught in the shadow of empire, striving for prosperity while bound by laws and wars not of their making. They had planted deep in New England, but the ground itself trembled with the footsteps of kings, armies and merchants who saw them as pieces in a game of power. And yet, within those shadows, seeds of something new were stirring. Seeds of restlessness, of questioning, of the faint yet growing belief that a people so distant from their rulers might one day seek a different path. The Whitfields, though they did not yet know it, were standing at the threshold of an age that would demand more of them than toil and prayer. The soil of America was fertile not only for crops but for ideas, and the generations to come would find themselves sowing and reaping a harvest unlike any their forebears could have imagined. The shadows of empire stretched long, but within them the first outlines of a new dawn were beginning to form. And the Whitfields, like countless other families, would soon find themselves swept into a storm far greater than famine or winter. A storm that would shape not only their destiny, but the destiny of a nation yet unborn. Part 5. Drums in the Distance, 1730s, 1750s. By the 1730s, the Whitfields had become a sprawling clan scattered across Massachusetts and the surrounding colonies. Their name carried in both farming communities and bustling ports. The family had endured famine, war, and the grinding weight of empire, yet each new generation seemed larger and more ambitious than the last. Grandchildren of John the Elder were now adults with families of their own. And the Whitfield story was no longer confined to a single homestead, but echoed in fields, taverns, meeting houses, and merchant docks. It was in these decades that the pulse of the colonies began to quicken, faint yet undeniable, like the distant beating of drums that warned of approaching change. The younger Whitfields grew restless in a world that seemed caught between old traditions and new possibilities. The stern Puritan values of their grandparents still hung heavy in sermons and family rules, but something in the air was shifting. The rigid faith that had once bound communities together began to loosen. And the younger generation sought answers not only in Scripture, but in ideas carried across the ocean from England and beyond. Enlightenment thought, with its emphasis on reason, natural rights, and the questioning of authority, began to seep into colonial life. In Boston taverns, in pamphlets passed hand to hand, in lectures given by wandering ministers and philosophers, the Whitfields encountered words that stirred them: liberty, equality, the pursuit of knowledge not for survival, but for understanding. One Whitfield who embodied this restless spirit was Jonathan, grandson of Thomas the Merchant. Born in 1715, he grew up among the wharves and warehouses of Boston, his boyhood filled with the cries of sailors, the scent of salt and tar, the clamor of carts rolling through narrow streets. Unlike his forefathers who clung to soil, Jonathan was drawn to books. He apprenticed under a printer and soon discovered a world far larger than trade. Through ink-stained hands, he read the works of Locke, Montesquieu, and other voices of the Enlightenment. He devoured pamphlets that debated government, liberty, and the rights of man. By his early 20s, Jonathan was not only a printer, but a writer, publishing essays under pseudonyms that challenged unjust taxes and called for greater freedoms in the colonies. His words carried further than his family realized, planting seeds of thought that would one day bear revolutionary fruit. Yet while Jonathan stirred minds with ink, his cousins carried muskets on the frontier. The 1730s and 1740s saw rising conflict as English settlers pushed westward, pressing against French claims in native homelands. Daniel's son, William Whitfield, born on the farm but eager for adventure, joined expeditions into unsettled territories. He helped clear land, build cabins, and establish fragile outposts that stood as beacons of English expansion. But these ventures came at great cost. Skirmishes with native warriors were frequent, raids left settlers dead or fleeing. The shadow of French fortresses loomed beyond the forests. William returned home with scars both on his body and in his heart, yet he remained convinced that the land was their destiny. His letters spoke of a hunger for space, for opportunity, for the right of English colonists to claim what the wilderness offered. His words echoed the desires of countless others, even as they sowed the seeds of future conflict with those who already called the land home. Meanwhile, in the towns and villages, another force swept through the colonies: the Great Awakening. By the late 1730s, preachers with fiery voices and trembling hands spread across New England, calling for repentance, revival, and a personal relationship with God that transcended stale traditions. The movement shook the Whitfield family as deeply as it did the colonies at large. Samuel Whitfield's granddaughter, Elizabeth, found herself enraptured by the sermons of George Whitfield, no relation, whose thunderous voice carried to thousands gathered in open fields. She wept openly, confessed her sins, and spoke passionately of being reborn in spirit. Her letters to kin urged them to embrace the revival, to feel God's presence not as doctrine but as fire. Yet not all were convinced. Jonathan the printer criticized the movement in his essays, warning that emotional frenzy threatened reason and order. The Whitfields, like many families, found themselves divided at their own tables, some uplifted by revival, others wary of excess. This tension mirrored the greater colonial struggle between tradition, passion, and the new stirrings of independent thought. The 1740s also brought war once more. Known in the colonies as King George's War, it was yet another extension of European conflict spilling onto American soil. Massachusetts called for militia, and the Whitfields answered as they always had. William marched northward, joining expeditions against French strongholds. The most notable was the 1745 siege of Louisbourg, a mighty fortress on Cape Breton Island. Colonial soldiers, including men like William, endured brutal cold, meager rations, and relentless labor as they dragged cannons through mud and marsh to position against the French walls. Against all odds, the fortress fell to colonial forces, a stunning victory that brought jubilation to New England. The Whitfields celebrated, proud that one of their own had played a part in such a triumph. Yet the glory was short-lived. When news arrived that England had returned Louisbourg to France in a treaty, outrage swept the colonies. William spat bitterly that their sacrifices had been traded away like pawns. It was a lesson that seared itself into his heart. The empire did not see its colonists as equals, but as tools to be used and discarded. As the 1750s dawned, the Whitfields stood at a crossroads, their lives bound in a web of faith, trade, war, and restless ambition. Jonathan's essays grew sharper, challenging not only the Crown's trade restrictions, but also the complacency of colonial leaders. William prepared his sons for the inevitability of further war with France, drilling them in the use of muskets and the discipline of the militia. Elizabeth continued to preach revival within the family, urging her kin to find solace in faith amid the uncertainties of the age. And across New England, the Whitfield name was spoken with a mixture of respect and curiosity. For they embodied the struggles of a people caught between obedience and yearning, between tradition and transformation. It was in these very years that the first true rumblings of a greater conflict began to sound. Beyond the Appalachian Mountains, the French built forts to secure their claims, while English settlers pushed ever westward. Native nations, caught between empires, defended their lands with determination. In Boston taverns, men whispered that another war loomed, one that would decide once and for all who controlled the vast interior of the continent. The Whitfields, though they did not yet know it, were about to be drawn into the greatest struggle of their age. The French and Indian War, a conflict that would not only reshape the map of North America, but ignite questions of loyalty, freedom, and destiny. By the mid-1750s, as the drums of war grew louder, the Whitfields stood ready. They were farmers, merchants, printers, soldiers, and believers, each carrying their own hopes and doubts. Yet together, they were part of something larger, a people on the edge of transformation. Their lives bound by forces both near and far. The distant drums of empire and revolution beat faintly still, but each passing year drew them closer, louder, more insistent. And when those drums finally thundered across the land, the Whitfields, like countless other families, would march to their sound, whether by choice or by fate. The world of their forefathers, the world of mere survival, was fading. A new world, uncertain and perilous, was rising. And the Whitfields, for all their divisions and struggles, were destined to play their part in its making. Part 6. The French and Indian War 1754-1763. The year was 1754. And in the dense forests beyond the Appalachian Mountains, muskets cracked, war cries echoed, and the soil of the frontier was soaked with blood. For the Whitfields, whose sons and grandsons had grown accustomed to the rhythm of colonial wars, this conflict was unlike anything they had ever known. It was not a distant fight carried from Europe, nor a passing raid on the borderlands. This was a struggle for the very heart of the continent, a war that would pit Britain and her colonies against France and her vast network of native allies. It would test the endurance of families like the Whitfields and leave scars both visible and unseen that would last for generations. The spark came in the Ohio Valley, where English settlers pressed into lands long claimed by the French. Among the first colonial troops sent west was a tall, ambitious young Virginian named George Washington, whose skirmish at Fort Necessity ignited a war that soon spread across the globe. When word of these clashes reached Massachusetts, the Whitfields felt the pull of duty once more. William Whitfield, scarred from earlier battles, was now too old to march, but his sons were eager. John the eldest enlisted in the Massachusetts militia. His brother Samuel followed, leaving behind their mother and younger siblings to tend the farm. Their departure echoed an old rhythm of the family story: men marching to war, women and elders struggling to keep homes and fields alive. The war quickly revealed itself to be unlike the campaigns of Europe. The wilderness swallowed armies whole. Roads were few, rivers treacherous, forests thick with ambush. The French and their native allies fought with a ferocity and cunning that startled British officers, schooled as they were in rigid formations and open-field battles. The Whitfield brothers found themselves marching through endless wilderness, hacking roads, carrying supplies, and sleeping in the mud. They endured hunger when supply trains faltered, sickness that spread through crowded camps, and the constant fear of ambush in the night. Yet for all the misery, there was a grim pride in standing shoulder to shoulder with fellow colonists, defending not just their farms but the future of English America. One of the war's darkest moments came in 1755, when British General Braddock led an expedition against Fort Duquesne. Among the colonial troops were men like John Whitfield, who marched through the wilderness under a blazing summer sun. When the French and their native allies struck, chaos reigned. Redcoats fell in droves, their rigid lines useless against warriors who fired from behind trees and rocks. Braddock himself was killed, and the expedition ended in disaster. John barely escaped with his life, his uniform torn, his musket lost. His memory forever haunted by the screams of dying comrades. He returned to Camp Gaunt and hollow-eyed, a reminder of how brutal and uncertain this war truly was. Yet the Whitfields, like the colonies, did not falter. They learned to fight in the forests, to adapt to the guerrilla tactics of their foes. By the late 1750s, with reinforcements from Britain and a new strategy under leaders like William Pitt, the tide began to turn. John and Samuel Whitfield fought in campaigns that struck deep into French territory. They endured long marches northward, where the biting cold cut as deeply as any blade. They saw comrades freeze to death on picket duty, and they themselves staggered through snow with only meager rations of hard bread. But they also witnessed great victories. In 1758, the capture of Louisbourg brought jubilation, for the mighty fortress that had once been traded away was finally secured. Samuel wrote home of the thunder of cannons, the smoke that hung over the harbor, and the sense that the colonies had achieved something monumental. The following year, the Whitfields were part of the army that struck at Quebec, the very heart of French Canada. John was there when General Wolfe led his men up the steep cliffs under cover of night, seizing the plains of Abraham at dawn. He saw Wolfe fall, mortally wounded, and he heard the cry that the French were retreating. For John, the moment was seared into his soul, the sense of standing at the turning point of history, where empires rose and fell in the space of an hour. Back home in Massachusetts, the family endured their own trials. Fields went untilled, debts mounted, and the absence of sons weighed heavily. Mothers like Sarah Whitfield bore the burden of raising children alone, of stretching food through lean winters, of tending fields with hands blistered and weary. They listened anxiously for news, sometimes months delayed, and prayed with fervor that their sons would return. The Whitfield women, though less celebrated than soldiers, carried their own kind of heroism, holding the family together while the men fought. By 1760, the war neared its end. Montreal fell, and with it the French hold on Canada collapsed. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 confirmed Britain's dominance, granting her vast territories from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. The colonies rejoiced, believing that at last they were secure, that the dream of expansion into the interior could finally be realized. John and Samuel returned home, bearing scars, medals, and stories that would be told by firelight for years to come. They embraced their families, rebuilt their lives, and celebrated the prospect of peace. But peace came with complications. Britain, victorious but deeply in debt, looked to her colonies to help bear the cost. Taxes were raised, trade was restricted, and colonial hopes of unfettered expansion westward were crushed by the proclamation of 1763, which barred settlement beyond the Appalachians. For the Whitfields, who had shed blood to secure those very lands, the decree felt like betrayal. John, in particular, who had marched through the forests and seen comrades die for the Ohio Valley, seethed at the injustice. The drums of war had fallen silent, but the drumbeat of discontent began to grow louder in his heart. The French and Indian War had changed the colonies forever. It had taught men like John Whitfield that colonial soldiers could fight and win alongside, and sometimes despite British regulars. It had exposed the arrogance of imperial leaders and the sacrifices of ordinary farmers and tradesmen. It had opened vast new lands, yet revealed how tightly Britain intended to control them. For the Whitfields, as for many families, the war was both triumph and disillusionment, victory and awakening. In the years to come, as new taxes and laws pressed down on the colonies, the memories of frozen camps, desperate marches, and blood-soaked fields would not fade. Instead, they would harden into conviction that the sacrifices of colonial families deserved more than dismissal, that their voices mattered, and that perhaps one day they would no longer fight for Britain, but for themselves. And so, the Whitfields returned to their farms and trades, their hearths and meeting houses, yet the echoes of musket fire in the wilderness lingered. The war was over, but its legacy had only just begun. Part 7. Seeds of Revolution, 1763 to 1770. The year 1763 should have been a time of triumph for the Whitfield family and for all the colonies. Britain had emerged from the French and Indian War victorious, her banners flying over Canada, her enemies humbled. John and Samuel Whitfield returned from the wilderness campaigns, bore themselves with the quiet pride of men who had marched through snow, faced musket fire, and lived to tell the tale. Their neighbors called them veterans now, and in the taverns of Boston, they were respected as men who had bled for the safety of their colony. Yet as they tried to resume the rhythms of peacetime, plowing fields, raising families, worshipping on Sundays, they began to sense that the war had not truly ended. The battles had ceased, yes, but a new struggle was forming, one that would shake the colonies more deeply than anything before. The first tremor came with the proclamation of 1763, a decree issued from London that forbade settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. The Whitfields had dreamed of moving westward, perhaps into the fertile valleys they had glimpsed during campaigns. Two men like John, who had fought at Fort Duquesne and seen comrades die in the forests of the Ohio Valley, this law felt like a cruel joke. Why had they fought, if not to secure new lands? The proclamation was meant to prevent further conflict with native nations. But to the colonists, it looked like Britain favoring its own convenience over their sacrifices. Discontent simmered quietly at first, like embers under ash. But soon Britain's need to pay down war debts led to a flurry of new taxes and trade restrictions. In 1764 came the Sugar Act, imposing duties on molasses and other imports. Merchants in Boston groaned, for smuggling had long been the lifeblood of trade, and now customs officers prowled the docks with sharper eyes. The Whitfields, though farmers more than merchants, felt the sting as well. Rum prices rose, trade slowed, and the colony seemed strangled by regulations from across the ocean. Then came the Stamp Act of 1765, a law that cut to the heart of daily life. Suddenly, every legal document, newspaper, almanac, and even playing card required a government stamp purchased from the crown. It was not the size of the tax that enraged the colonists so much as the principle. Parliament was reaching into their pockets without their consent. In taverns and meeting houses, fiery speeches rang out. No taxation without representation became the cry, a phrase that John Whitfield repeated often, his fist thumping the table for emphasis. For John, who had shouldered a musket in defense of Britain, the notion that his loyalty was repaid with shackles was intolerable. The Whitfield family became part of the swelling tide of protest. Samuel, less hot-tempered than his elder brother, wrote pamphlets and letters, adding his voice to the growing chorus of colonial dissent. John Boulder joined the mobs that roamed Boston's streets, hanging effigies of tax collectors and harassing officials who tried to enforce the hated law. Their wives, too, took part in resistance. Sarah Whitfield and her neighbors formed sewing circles, producing homespun cloth to boycott British imports. They brewed bitter herbal teas in defiance of taxed leaves shipped from London. Even the youngest Whitfields absorbed the spirit of rebellion, listening wide-eyed as their father spoke of liberty and rights. Boston, the heart of Massachusetts, grew ever more restless. The Sons of Liberty, a secretive group of radicals, organized demonstrations and stoked the fires of resistance. Crowds gathered beneath the Liberty Tree, where speeches were delivered and plans made. John Whitfield, his voice rough from years of shouting over battlefield noise, found a new purpose here, shouting for freedom instead of orders. The Liberty Tree became almost sacred ground to him, a symbol of the justice he believed was their due. In 1766, news arrived that the Stamp Act had been repealed after fierce protest. Bells rang, crowds cheered, and the Whitfields joined in the celebrations. But the joy was short-lived, for Britain immediately passed the Declaratory Act, asserting her right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. It was a warning, a reminder that Parliament had no intention of loosening its grip. The colonists had won a battle, but the War of Wills had only begun. The next blow came with the Townshend Acts of 1767, which placed duties on imports such as glass, paint, paper, and tea. Once again, resistance flared. Boycotts spread, and tensions in Boston grew sharper. Customs officials became targets of scorn, and British soldiers were dispatched to keep order in the unruly port. For the first time, the Whitfields saw red-coated regulars not as allies in war, but as enforcers of tyranny. John in particular bristled at the sight of them marching through Boston's streets, their muskets gleaming, their bayonets catching the sun. To him, they were not protectors, but occupiers. By 1768, Boston was a city on edge. Dockworkers, merchants, soldiers, and patriots jostled daily, insults flung as readily as stones. Taverns rang with arguments, broadsides carried biting satire, and the Sons of Liberty plotted in secret rooms. The Whitfields, like many families, lived in a state of restless anticipation, waiting for the spark that would turn discontent into open flame. That spark came on a bitterly cold night in March 1770. Snow lay heavy on the streets. Tempers were short. A crowd of Bostonians confronted a small group of British soldiers near the custom house. Insults turned to taunts. Taunts two thrown snowballs. Snowballs two rocks. Amid the chaos, a shot rang out. Then another. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead or dying in the snow, their blood staining the frozen ground. The Boston Massacre, as it was quickly named, sent shockwaves through the city and across the colonies. John Whitfield was among the first on the scene, pushing through the crowd to kneel beside one of the fallen. He would never forget the sight, the lifeless eyes staring upward, blood pooling dark against the snow, the cries of the wounded mingling with the shouts of rage. For John, it was the moment when all doubt fell away. Britain was no longer merely misguided or unfair. She was cruel, oppressive, and dangerous. In the days that followed, the Whitfield home became a gathering place for neighbors who whispered of freedom, of rights, of vengeance. Samuel, more cautious, urged patience and law, reminding his brother that rash action could bring ruin. But even he could not deny that the massacre had changed everything. It was no longer just taxes and trade. It was life and death, freedom and tyranny. By the close of the decade, the Whitfields and their fellow colonists stood on the brink of something new and terrible. The seeds had been planted, watered with anger and blood. The soil of America, once tilled for crops, was now fertile with the dreams of liberty. The Whitfields did not yet know how those dreams would be realized, nor what sacrifices still lay ahead. But they knew, as surely as they had known the weight of their muskets in past wars, that the struggle could not be avoided. The storm was coming, and they would be in the very heart of it. Part 8. The Tea Party and the Road to Rebellion, 1770 to 1774. The year 1770 closed with grief and anger in Boston. Yet time moved forward, as it always does. The Whitfields, like many families, carried the memory of the Boston Massacre, as though it were a scar upon their hearts. John, restless and ever quick to action, told the tale often in the taverns, his booming voice recounting how blood had frozen in the snow, how British muskets had cut down unarmed men. Samuel, quieter, carried the memory in his writing, penning essays that circulated through Boston's underground presses, reminding readers that liberty once lost was rarely regained without struggle. For a brief moment, tension seemed to ease. Parliament repealed most of the hated townshend duties, leaving only the tax on tea as a symbol of its authority. Some Bostonians breathed easier, grateful for even a small concession, but the Whitfields did not. To John, it was not relief, but insult. "They think we will bow for a cup of tea," he told his brother. "They think we will forget blood spilled in King Street if they lift a few tariffs. They're wrong." Samuel nodded, his brow furrowed, knowing his brother's words held truth. The presence of British soldiers remained, their red coats stark against Boston's narrow streets, their drums rattling through dawn and dusk. Each day was a reminder that Boston was no longer free. The 1770s brought changes within the Whitfield household as well. John's eldest son, Thomas, now nearly grown, hungered to follow in his father's footsteps. He practiced with the family musket behind the barn, his aim sharp, his stance bold. John felt both pride and fear watching him. He had fought Britain once as an ally, and now his son might soon fight them as an enemy. Sarah Whitfield, John's wife, prayed nightly for peace. Though her hands worked constantly with other women in the spinning bees, weaving cloth to replace British imports, even the children understood that their lives were entangled with the fate of the colonies. Liberty was no longer an abstract idea, was woven into every garment, tasted in every sip of herbal tea, spoken in every whispered conversation. By 1773, Parliament struck again with the Tea Act, a law that gave the struggling East India Company the right to sell its vast surplus of tea directly to the colonies, bypassing merchants and undercutting local trade. Though it made tea cheaper, the tax remained, and the act was seen not as a gift, but as a trick away to make colonists swallow tyranny with their drink. To the Whitfields and their neighbors, it was intolerable. Boston's patriots vowed that no tea would be landed, no tax paid. Ships bearing the cargo arrived in the harbor, and tension mounted daily as meetings were held at the Old South Meeting House. Crowds grew larger, voices louder. It was on a cold December evening in 1773 that John Whitfield found himself among thousands of Bostonians gathered to decide the fate of the tea. Samuel was there as well, his quill tucked into his coat pocket, ready to record the events for posterity. The crowd roared with speeches, each one demanding defiance. At last, when it was clear the governor would not yield, a cry rose from the back of the hall. Men disguised as Mohawk Indians slipped into the streets, their faces painted, their movements purposeful. John knew what was about to happen, and though he had not donned disguise himself, he followed into the night, his heart pounding like a drum. The men boarded the ships in Boston Harbor, their axes flashing under the moonlight. Chests of tea were split open and heaved into the black water, the sea swallowing the leaves as the crowd on shore cheered. John Whitfield's voice rose with theirs, his throat raw from shouting. Samuel, standing beside him, wrote later that it was not vandalism, but a declaration, a message to Britain that Americans would not be tricked into submission. The smell of tea lingered in the harbor for days, a perfume of rebellion that clung to the air and to memory. Britain's response was swift and merciless. In 1774, Parliament passed what the colonists would call the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was closed until the destroyed tea was paid for. The colonial charter of Massachusetts was revoked, stripping away self-government. British soldiers were quartered in private homes, their presence now not just in the streets but under the very roofs of citizens. The Whitfields felt the sting keenly. Trade dried up, their neighbors' shops shuttered, hunger crept into homes. Sarah shared what food they could spare, even as their own children grew thinner. John grew more furious with each passing day, his voice carrying across town meetings where men spoke of uniting the colonies in common cause. It was during this time that the first whispers of a Continental Congress reached Boston. Delegates from across the colonies would gather to present a united front against British tyranny. Samuel Whitfield, respected for his writing and moderate stance, was chosen as a messenger to carry news and letters southward. He traveled roads heavy with dust, crossing rivers and mountains, meeting men from Virginia, Pennsylvania, and beyond, who shared the same anger and resolve. When he returned, his eyes burned with conviction. "We are not alone, brother," he told John. "From New England to the Carolinas, men are rising. The king believes us weak and divided. He does not see that his cruelty has bound us together." The Whitfield family, like countless others, found themselves preparing not only for leaner days but for the possibility of war. Muskets were cleaned, powder stored, and drills conducted in the village green. John's son Thomas stood proudly in the line of young men, shouldering his weapon with determination. John watched him with a mixture of dread and admiration. He could not forbid his son the fight, for he knew it was the same fire that burned in his own chest. Sarah wept quietly at night, her prayers for peace now mingled with pleas for protection. As 1774 drew to a close, Boston had become a city under siege, not yet by cannon and shot, but by hunger, fear, and the weight of British authority. The Whitfields endured, their resolve hardening with each new measure of oppression. They gathered by candlelight, reading aloud the words of Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and other patriots whose voices carried across the colonies. Liberty was no longer just a dream whispered under the Liberty Tree. It was a cause, a necessity, a destiny. John Whitfield often walked to the harbor at night, staring out at the dark waters where the tea had been spilled. He thought of the years past, of battles fought for Britain, of friends lost in wilderness campaigns, of loyalty once given freely. Now, all of that seemed distant, almost like another life. He knew, as surely as he knew the lines of his own weathered hands, that the next conflict would not be fought for king or empire, but for something greater, for freedom itself. The road to rebellion was nearly complete. All that remained was the spark to ignite it. And when it came, the Whitfields would be ready, their lives forever bound to the storm of revolution. Part 9. The First Shots. Lexington and Concord, 1775. The winter of 1774 into the spring of 1775 settled over Boston like a heavy fog, thick with tension and expectation. The city was strangled by the coercive axe, its harbor closed, its people hungry, its freedom shackled. Yet in the hearts of many, including the Whitfields, there flickered a flame that no decree could extinguish. For John Whitfield, every knock at the door, every drumbeat of a British patrol, every whispered rumor at the tavern felt like the tremor before an earthquake. He knew everyone knew that war was no longer a distant possibility, it was inevitable. Samuel Whitfield, ever the quieter voice of reason, filled his evenings writing by candlelight. He corresponded with patriots across the colonies, recording minutes from clandestine meetings, copying the fiery resolutions passed in town gatherings. His words were careful, deliberate, but filled with conviction. He often said to his brother, "Ink is our first musket, John. Before powder is fired, we must convince men of the justice of our cause." And yet, Samuel too felt the quickening pace of destiny. His quill might persuade hearts, but steel and powder would decide the future. John's eldest son, Thomas, by now a strapping youth, drilled with other village boys under the watchful eye of the town militia captain. They called themselves Minutemen, vowing to be ready at a moment's call. John watched him march across the green, musket on his shoulder, chin lifted with determination, and felt pride and dread interwoven so tightly he could scarcely tell them apart. Sarah, his wife, busied herself with knitting stockings for the men, her prayers whispered constantly beneath her breath. She had once prayed for peace. Now she prayed for courage. News came in April of 1775 that General Gage, the British commander in Boston, planned to seize colonial stores of powder and arms hidden in Concord, a small town beyond the city. The countryside stirred with rumors, and riders carried warnings across the night. Among them was Paul Revere, whose midnight gallop through the villages would soon become legend. The Whitfields heard the hoofbeats before they heard the words. The regulars are coming out. The cry was taken up by voice after voice, echoing down the road like a rolling drumbeat of destiny. John was already awake, his musket propped by the door. He strapped on his powder horn, kissed Sarah quickly, and turned to Thomas. "Oh, come with me, lad." Sarah caught Thomas's hand, her eyes wide with fear. "He's but a boy," she whispered. John's gaze softened, but did not waver. "So was I when I first carried a musket for the king. Now he'll carry one for liberty." With that, father and son joined the stream of men gathering on the Lexington Green under lantern light. The night was chill, mist hanging low, as farmers and shopkeepers shouldered their arms. They were ordinary men, not soldiers, but they stood with the gravity of those who know their moment in history has come. Captain Parker, their leader, spoke firmly but quietly. "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." John squeezed Thomas's shoulder, feeling the boy tremble yet stand tall. As dawn broke, the sound of marching feet reached them, the steady, disciplined tread of British regulars advancing. Red coats gleamed in the pale light, bayonets fixed, drums beating. The two lines faced one another, silence heavy in the spring air. No one knows who fired the first shot. Some said it came from a musket in the crowd, others from a nervous soldier's hand. But once the crack split the air, the world changed forever. Smoke drifted, shouts erupted, and muskets barked. Men fell on the Lexington Green, some dead, some wounded, while others scattered in confusion. John fired once, the recoil jarring his shoulder, then pulled Thomas behind him as the boy raised his musket. "Not yet," John growled, shielding him from the volley that cut down neighbors and friends. In moments, the skirmish was over. The regulars marched on toward Concord, leaving the green stained with blood. Samuel, arriving late with other townsmen, knelt by the fallen, his hands trembling as he pressed cloth to wounds that would not close. But the fight was not finished. The British moved on to Concord, searching for hidden stores of powder. At the North Bridge, colonial militia gathered again, now more numerous. Their anger hardened by the sight of bloodied comrades. John and Thomas were among them, their faces set with grim determination. Samuel too had come, though he carried no musket, his presence a testament to solidarity. The air was tense as the British attempted to cross the bridge. Voices shouted, orders rang, and then shots cracked again. This time the colonists fired true. Smoke billowed, men staggered, and for the first time British regulars fell before American muskets. John's musket thundered, Thomas's beside his, the sound mingling with dozens more. Samuel stood back, scribbling notes in a small book, even as musket balls whistled past, knowing that history must be recorded even as it was made. The British faltered, retreating from the bridge, their confidence shaken. Word spread quickly through the countryside that blood had been shed, and the king's men had been driven back. Farmers, blacksmiths, and laborers poured into the roads with muskets, ambushing the British along their long retreat to Boston. From behind stone walls, from thickets and barns, the colonists fired relentlessly, sniping at the scarlet ranks. The retreat became a gauntlet of fire. The king's proud army harried every step of the way. John and Thomas fought alongside their neighbors, darting between trees, loading and firing with frantic speed. Thomas's hands were blistered, his shoulder bruised, but his eyes blazed with fierce joy. "We're driving them back, Father," he shouted. John nodded, though his heart was heavy with the weight of what they had unleashed. There would be no turning back now. By nightfall, the regulars staggered into the safety of Boston, leaving the countryside in the hands of the militia. The colonies had drawn blood. The revolution had begun. The Whitfields returned home exhausted, their clothes singed with powder, their ears ringing from musket fire. Sarah wept at the sight of them, clutching both husband and son to her chest. "You came back," she whispered. John kissed her forehead, his eyes shadowed. "I love. But the war has come with us." Samuel sat by the hearth that night, pen scratching across paper. He described the green at Lexington, the bridge at Concord, the long retreat through fire and smoke. His words carried both grief for the fallen and pride for the living. He knew these words would travel far, to Philadelphia, to Virginia, even across the ocean. They would tell the world that Americans had stood and fought, that liberty had been baptized in musket fire. The Whitfields were forever changed. John's hand shook slightly as he cleaned his musket, the images of the day replaying in his mind. Thomas spoke little, though his eyes burned with newfound purpose. Sarah moved quietly, her prayers now for strength to endure what she knew was only beginning. Samuel wrote until his candle guttered, then sat in silence, staring at the flame. The first shots had been fired. The world would never be the same. And for the Whitfields, as for all of America, there was no path backward, only forward into the storm of revolution. Part 10. The Siege of Boston and Bunker Hill, 1775. The spring of 1775 had ignited a fire that would not be easily extinguished. Following the clashes at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts became a vast, simmering cauldron of armed patriots and tense redcoats. Boston, hemmed in by thousands of colonial militia, found itself under siege, its streets heavy with soldiers and loyalists alike. The Whitfields, like countless other families, found themselves both participants and witnesses to this turning point in history. Their lives, already steeped in duty and sacrifice, would now be tested as never before. John Whitfield rose before dawn each morning, inspecting muskets, distributing powder, and organizing local Minutemen along the outskirts of the city. He was a seasoned veteran, his hands scarred from years of campaigns. But the gravity of the current moment weighed heavily on him. "Keep your heads," he would say, addressing the young men in the militia, "and your powder dry. The time is coming when courage will decide everything." His son Thomas, now nearly a man, marched beside him, musket on shoulder, learning the discipline of command as much as the art of war. Sarah Whitfield prepared provisions and blankets for the men, knowing full well that the coming months would be cold and cruel, and that each day could bring news of death and injury. The colonial forces encircled Boston, digging trenches, fortifying positions, and gathering supplies from neighboring towns. It was a ragged army of farmers, tradesmen, and laborers, united by a cause but divided in experience. Many had never fired a musket before the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord. Now they trained endlessly, drilling for the moment when confrontation would become inevitable. John drilled his men with patience and precision, emphasizing discipline and teamwork, knowing that chaos in battle could be fatal. In June 1775, the attention of the colonial forces turned to Charlestown Heights, where the British had established a commanding position overlooking Boston and the harbor. General Israel Putnam and Colonel William Prescott organized an assault on Breed's Hill, seeking to challenge the regulars and demonstrate that colonial forces could stand against the British Army. John Whitfield. Thomas at his side joined the ranks, knowing that this engagement would be unlike any skirmish they had faced. Samuel, remaining behind the lines, documented the preparations, his notes brimming with the tension and anticipation of a people on the cusp of war. The night before the attack, the Patriots worked under cover of darkness, hauling earth, timber, supplies to construct a redoubt on Breed's Hill. Sweat poured from their brows, and the quiet whisper of the wind was punctuated by the occasional shout or clang of tools. John wiped the grime from his face, glancing at his son. Thomas's hands were blistered, but his eyes burned with determination. "Remember," John said quietly, "hold your ground. Stand firm. We may not win today, but we will show them we will not yield." The men nodded, understanding that courage mattered as much as strategy in the battles to come. Dawn broke on June 17, 1775, revealing the hastily constructed fortifications and the advancing lines of British soldiers. The redcoats marched in perfect formation, their bayonets glinting, drums pounding, a symbol of disciplined power against the ragged colonials. The air was tense, every heartbeat measured, every breath heavy with fear and resolve. John Whitfield felt his chest tighten as the enemy approached, his musket ready, his mind recalling every lesson from campaigns past. Thomas stood beside him, shoulders squared, gripping his weapon with a firm resolve that belied his years. The first volleys rang out, and the battle erupted in a cacophony of gunfire, smoke, and shouts. The colonials held their ground, firing from behind the redoubt's walls, aiming carefully to maximize effect. British soldiers surged forward, their discipline tested against the unpredictable. Ferocious defense mounted by farmers and tradesmen who had little to lose but everything to gain. John reloaded, fired, and barked orders, his voice cutting through the chaos. Around him, men fell, some crying out in pain, others silent in death. Thomas fired as his father instructed, his hands trembling with adrenaline and fear, yet he continued, each shot a declaration that they would not be pushed aside. For hours, the battle raged. Smoke thickened, reducing visibility, and the air was filled with the acrid stench of gunpowder and blood. John witnessed friends and neighbors struck down, their lives ending in the mud and dust of the battlefield. Yet the Patriots stood, their morale bolstered by the knowledge that their resistance was making an impact. The regulars suffered heavy casualties, their disciplined lines unable to easily break through the determined colonial ranks. Samuel Whitfield, watching from a safer distance, noted every detail, recording acts of heroism, moments of terror, and the extraordinary courage of ordinary men. Eventually, the British forces succeeded in taking the redoubt after repeated assaults, forcing the colonials to withdraw to the rear. Despite the retreat, the engagement was hailed as a moral victory for the Americans. They had proven that untrained farmers could stand against the might of the British Army, that courage and determination could match discipline and experience. John and Thomas returned home bruised, exhausted, and shaken by the scale of the bloodshed, yet a grim satisfaction lingered. They had been part of something larger than themselves, a force that would shape the destiny of a nation. The siege of Boston continued, with the Whitfields and their neighbors maintaining positions. Gathering intelligence and preparing for the long struggle ahead, the city was cut off, supply lines disrupted, and morale tested by the relentless presence of enemy forces. John spent his days patrolling, training new recruits, and coordinating with other militia leaders. Thomas, hardened by the battle at Breed's Hill, assumed greater responsibility, leading small units and demonstrating a natural aptitude for command. Sarah, enduring the constant fear of news from the front, organized community support, ensuring the wounded and families of fallen soldiers were cared for. Throughout this period, Samuel Whitfield's writings began to circulate widely, reaching beyond Boston to other colonies. His detailed accounts of the Battle of Bunker Hill and the ongoing siege provided inspiration and a sense of unity. Among the disparate colonial communities, his words reminded the people that their struggle was not in vain, that each musket fired and each sacrifice made was a step toward liberty. By the end of 1775, the siege of Boston had settled into a tense stalemate. The British remained trapped within the city, wary of colonial forces that now outnumbered them and were increasingly organized. The Whitfields had endured combat, loss, and fear, yet they had emerged stronger, more resolute, and more committed to the cause of independence. The war was far from over, and the challenges ahead would be greater. But the first true battles had demonstrated that the colonies could stand, fight, and endure against the most powerful military force in the world. For the Whitfields, the siege of Boston and the Battle of Bunker Hill were transformative. John and Thomas carried the scars, both physical and emotional, of their first real engagements. Sarah's unwavering support provided a foundation of stability and hope. Samuel's chronicling of events ensured that their experiences, their courage, and their sacrifices would be remembered. The Whitfields were no longer just a family. They were a symbol of the collective struggle of ordinary colonists rising to meet extraordinary challenges. The year closed with the fires of revolution burning brighter than ever. Boston remained under siege, the colonies united in purpose, and the Whitfields ready to continue their fight for liberty, knowing that the coming years would demand courage, sacrifice, and unwavering resolve. Part 11. The Declaration of Independence and War spreads 1776-1777. The dawn of 1776 brought both hope and uncertainty. Across the 13 colonies, whispers of liberty had turned into open calls for independence. For the Whitfields, the years of struggle, the battles at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill, the sieges, the blood spilled, and the homes disrupted had all led to this moment. The talk in Boston, in taverns, at town meetings, and in letters carried from Philadelphia to New England had become clear. The colonies could no longer be subject to the will of a distant king. They must govern themselves, defend themselves, and, if necessary, fight for themselves. John Whitfield felt the weight of this moment acutely. The muskets that had once defended farms and towns now symbolized a far larger purpose.
Wow.
The men he commanded had grown from frightened farmers into seasoned militia, capable of facing the might of the British Army. His son Thomas, now a young man hardened by battles, stood at his father's side, ready to shoulder the responsibility that war demanded. Sarah Whitfield, ever vigilant, prepared their home to serve as a place of refuge and supply, knowing that the fight ahead would be long and fraught with danger. On July 4, 1776, news reached Boston that the Continental Congress in Philadelphia had formally declared independence. The Declaration of Independence, penned largely by Thomas Jefferson, proclaimed that all men were created equal, endowed with unalienable rights, and that governments derived their just powers from the consent of the governed. To John, Samuel, and the entire Whitfield family, it was both a moment of triumph and a call to arms. Liberty was no longer a distant dream. It was a tangible goal, one that required continued sacrifice. Samuel, whose writings had already inspired many, recorded the declaration in careful script, noting the joy, the apprehension, and the solemn resolve it inspired across the colonies. The war quickly spread beyond Boston. British forces regrouped, seeking to suppress the rebellion before it could gain full momentum. The Whitfields, like many families in Massachusetts, were drawn into the broader conflict. John and Thomas joined expeditions to harass British supply lines, defend strategic positions, and rally local militias. The countryside became a chessboard of skirmishes, raids, and counterattacks. Each encounter brought victories and losses, the grim calculus of war weighing heavily on every family and community. Winter 1776 was particularly brutal. Washington's army, retreating across New Jersey, faced frost, hunger, and dwindling morale. John Whitfield's militia provided local support, guiding troops, supplying provisions, and ensuring that no one was left behind. Thomas, following in his father's footsteps, learned to lead small detachments, carrying out reconnaissance and skirmishes to slow British advances. Sarah Whitfield, resilient and resourceful, organized efforts to care for wounded soldiers, transport supplies, and maintain communication among local committees of safety. The Whitfields' home became a hub of patriotic activity, a microcosm of the collective effort sustaining the Revolution. In December 1776, Washington famously crossed the Delaware River, striking the Hessian forces in Trenton. The news of victory lifted spirits across the colonies, and the Whitfields rejoiced alongside their neighbors. John recognized the strategic brilliance and audacity of such maneuvers. understanding that while the militia could not always face the British in open battle, cunning, timing, and unity could turn the tide. Thomas absorbed every lesson, his confidence growing as he witnessed leadership, courage, and sacrifice in action. As 1777 unfolded, the war spread to New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Battles at Saratoga, Brandywine, and Germantown tested the mettle of American forces. John Whitfield's militia took part in defensive actions, fortifying positions, conducting patrols, and providing intelligence to Continental commanders. Samuel continued his meticulous chronicling, ensuring that the events, strategies, and human stories were preserved for future generations. Sarah Whitfield's tireless work in supporting soldiers and displaced families provided the backbone of the home front, without which the war effort would falter. Victory at Saratoga in October 1777 marked a turning point. The American triumph not only boosted morale, but also secured crucial support from France, whose alliance would prove decisive. John Whitfield allowed himself a rare moment of reflection, contemplating the years of hardship, the blood spilled, and the courage shown by ordinary men and women. Thomas, now a capable young officer, understood that the war was far from over, but the promise of international support renewed his determination. Throughout these campaigns, the Whitfields exemplified the spirit of the Revolution. John's leadership in the field, Thomas's growing tactical skill, Sarah's unwavering care and management of supplies, and Samuel's writings all contributed to the larger cause. Their story mirrored that of countless other families whose combined efforts sustained the rebellion through its most perilous years. By the end of 1777, the Declaration of Independence had become more than a document. It was a living mission. The colonies were no longer simply protesting British rule. They were fighting for survival, for recognition, and for the right to shape their own destiny. The Whitfields, like so many others, had endured the first full waves of war, witnessing both horror and heroism, despair and triumph. Each victory, each loss, each act of courage forged the path toward the eventual birth of a nation. The Whitfields' journey through the early years of independence was a testament to resilience, loyalty to principle, and the enduring power of family. As the war spread across the colonies, they remained steadfast, knowing that liberty demanded courage, sacrifice, and unwavering resolve. The battles of 1776 and 1777 were only the beginning, but they had proven that ordinary citizens could rise to extraordinary challenges, and that the dream of a free America was within reach, even amid the chaos and carnage of war. Part 12. Valley Forge and Winter Hardships 1777-1778. The winter of 1777 to 1778 descended upon the colonies like a silent and unyielding force. Snow blanketed the fields, ice formed across rivers, and bitter winds swept through forests and villages. For the Whitfields, as for thousands of families across the fledgling nation, the cold brought challenges as severe as any battlefield. The Continental Army, under General George Washington, had retreated to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, and while the enemy remained at a distance, the suffering of men, horses, and families at the encampment was immediate and severe. John Whitfield had followed reports closely, his concern not just for the strategic situation but for the lives of men who had become almost like family. Thomas, now a young officer in the militia attached to Washington's forces, had been assigned duties that brought him to the encampment. The journey from Massachusetts to Pennsylvania was long and perilous, with icy roads, swollen rivers, and unpredictable weather. Yet the Whitfields pressed on, determined to provide aid, guidance, and, where possible, direct leadership. Upon arrival at Valley Forge, the sight was staggering. Thousands of men huddled in crude huts or tents, their clothing tattered, boots worn through, faces gaunt from hunger and disease. The stench of unwashed bodies and livestock mingled with the crisp winter air. John Whitfield felt a pang of sorrow and anger. These were men who had already fought, who had endured harsh campaigns, and now they were subjected to near starvation and exposure. Thomas moved among the troops, offering encouragement, distributing supplies, and helping to tend the wounded. Despite the misery, their spirits were bolstered by the presence of leaders who shared their hardships. Sarah Whitfield, back in Massachusetts, organized local committees to send food, blankets, clothing, medical supplies to the soldiers at Valley Forge. She rallied neighbors and families, emphasizing the importance of unity and perseverance. Her tireless efforts, along with countless others, provided a lifeline to men facing death not only from enemy fire, but from the merciless elements. Letters from Sarah reached John and Thomas regularly, her words a source of hope and grounding amid the endless struggle. Disease was rampant. Smallpox, typhus, and dysentery swept through the encampment, claiming lives even faster than the British muskets had. John Whitfield worked alongside surgeons and volunteers, helping to dig graves, care for the ill, and ensure that the living maintained some semblance of order and hygiene. Thomas, too, witnessed the fragility of human endurance. Yet even in the bleakest moments, the men shared stories, songs, and letters from home. Clinging to the belief that their sacrifices would not be in vain, winter drills became a daily necessity. General von Steuben, the Prussian officer, sent to train the Continental Army, transformed ragged farmers into disciplined soldiers. John and Thomas absorbed every lesson, learning proper formation, loading, and firing techniques. The training was grueling, often conducted in snow up to men's knees, but it instilled a newfound confidence. Men who had once scattered at the first sight of British lines now drilled with precision. Their morale slowly restored by discipline, purpose, and the knowledge that they were learning the skills necessary to defend their homeland. The Whitfields also faced personal challenges. The bitter cold tested their physical endurance. Food was scarce, and rations were minimal. Thomas's hands were cracked and raw from the cold. John's back ached from long days of labor and command, and Sarah, managing affairs from Massachusetts, worried constantly for their survival. Letters became a precious link, conveying both practical news and emotional support. The Whitfields' correspondence was filled with prayers, encouragement, and reports of incremental progress, testament to their resilience. Despite the hardships, moments of humanity and courage shone through. Men shared their limited food with comrades, tended one another when illness struck, and bolstered each other's spirits with stories of home and hope for the future. John Whitfield found a sense of purpose in these acts of solidarity, recognizing that war was as much about character and endurance as it was about muskets and strategy. Thomas, witnessing the young and old soldiers alike, confronting despair with courage, understood the depth of commitment required to fight for freedom. As the winter wore on, the Continental Army became stronger, more disciplined, and better prepared for the campaigns to come. Von Steuben's training, combined with the leadership of Washington and the dedication of men like John Whitfield, transformed Valley Forge from a symbol of suffering into a crucible of resolve. By the spring of 1778, the soldiers emerged hardened, disciplined, and ready to confront the British with renewed vigor. Sarah Whitfield's contributions from home were equally vital. She coordinated relief efforts, managed finances for local committees, and ensured that families of soldiers were supported. Her letters encouraged John and Thomas, reminding them that the fight was not only on the battlefield, but also in the hearts and homes of the American people. The Whitfields embodied the symbiotic relationship between the front lines and the home front, illustrating that victory depended as much on resilience, resourcefulness, and unity as it did on strategy and force. By the time spring arrived, the soldiers of Valley Forge were reborn. Though the scars of winter remained, lost lives, frozen limbs, and shattered morale, the Continental Army stood ready. John and Thomas Whitfield, hardened by experience, ready for the campaigns ahead, understood that the revolution was far from over. Their commitment to liberty, forged in battle and tempered by adversity, would guide them through the next stages of conflict. The winter at Valley Forge became legendary, a testament to endurance, sacrifice, and the unbreakable spirit of the American people. The Whitfields emerged from it not only as survivors but as leaders, their courage and resolve emblematic of the broader struggle for independence. They had witnessed suffering beyond imagination, faced disease, hunger, and the bitter cold, and yet remained steadfast. The lessons learned and the unity forged at Valley Forge would sustain them in the battles yet to come. As the fight for a free and independent nation marched relentlessly forward, Part 13, Southern Campaigns and Guerrilla Warfare 1778-1779 by 1778. The revolution had spread far beyond New England, and the southern colonies had become a new theater of conflict. Loyalist forces were strong in Georgia, South Carolina, and parts of North Carolina, and British commanders sought to exploit these divisions to regain control. The Whitfields, though based in Massachusetts, felt the ripple of this expansion as the Continental Congress called for reinforcements and experienced militia to aid in Southern campaigns. John Whitfield, now a seasoned leader, and Thomas, increasingly skilled in command, prepared to extend their fight to these distant colonies. The journey south was arduous. Harsh weather, muddy roads, and dense forests tested the endurance of the militia. Along the way, the Whitfields encountered towns whose loyalties were divided, some citizens fiercely patriotic, others steadfastly loyal to the crown. These encounters required both diplomacy and strength. John led scouting parties to gauge enemy positions, while Thomas learned to anticipate ambushes and plan counterattacks. Samuel Whitfield, though remaining in the North to chronicle events and support local committees, maintained correspondence that encouraged the family and provided critical intelligence about the Southern situation. Once in South Carolina, the Whitfields witnessed the brutal realities of Southern warfare. Battles were not confined to open fields. Instead, they took place in forests, along rivers, and on narrow roads. Guerrilla tactics became essential. Militias engaged in hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, and sabotage to harry British forces, disrupt supply lines, and protect local populations. John adapted quickly, drawing on years of experience in wilderness campaigns. Thomas, gaining confidence, led small detachments on raids against British patrols, learning the value of stealth, timing, and the intimate knowledge of terrain. One of the most pivotal engagements came near the town of Camden. British forces under General Cornwallis had secured significant control over South Carolina, and Patriot militias were struggling to mount effective resistance. John Whitfield's unit, alongside other regiments, launched a daring ambush on a convoy transporting British supplies. Using the cover of dense woods and the element of surprise, militia seized the supplies, inflicted casualties, and withdrew before the British could mount a counterattack. This success bolstered morale not only for the Whitfield's unit, but also for surrounding communities, demonstrating that courage, strategy, and local knowledge could offset the might of the British Army. Life in the Southern campaign was relentless. The Whitfields endured heat, humidity, insects, and disease. Dysentery, malaria, and smallpox were constant threats. John and Thomas worked to maintain discipline, provide care for the sick, and ensure that men remained ready for sudden engagements. Sleep was often scarce, food scarce and irregular, and every day brought new challenges. Yet the Whitfields' resilience, honed in Massachusetts and at Valley Forge, sustained them. They became a stabilizing presence among the militia, their leadership trusted and respected. Sarah Whitfield, though far from the front lines, continued to play a vital role. She coordinated support networks, raised funds, and ensured that families of soldiers received aid. Her letters, filled with encouragement and practical advice, traveled south with couriers, bolstering morale and connecting the northern and southern efforts. Samuel Whitfield's writings, documenting the Southern campaigns, preserved the narratives of these guerrilla actions, ensuring that the bravery and sacrifices of ordinary men and women were recorded for posterity. The Southern theater also revealed the harsh realities of divided loyalties. Patriots faced not only British soldiers, but neighbors who sided with the crown. Skirmishes sometimes devolved into brutal retaliations, and towns could be punished for perceived allegiance. John and Thomas had to navigate this complexity, balancing military objectives with the need to protect civilians and maintain support among local populations. Their experience and judgment were critical in preventing unnecessary violence and fostering unity among the disparate militias. One notable incident involved a loyalist patrol threatening a village near the Petey River. John Whitfield, Thomas at his side, devised a strategy to intercept the patrol without harming the villagers. Using the cover of the forest and coordinating with local militia, they successfully ambushed the loyalists, capturing several without bloodshed. This action earned the gratitude of the townspeople, strengthened local support, and demonstrated the effectiveness of careful planning and ethical leadership even in war. By 1779, the Southern campaigns had become a grueling test of endurance, strategy, and resilience. The Whitfields had faced numerous engagements, protected communities, and contributed to the broader effort to resist British advances. Guerrilla warfare proved effective in slowing enemy progress and maintaining morale, but it also required constant vigilance, adaptability, and courage. John and Thomas emerged from these campaigns as seasoned leaders, their experience invaluable to the Continental cause. The Southern campaigns also had lasting effects on the Whitfield family. John's leadership strengthened his bond with Thomas, who matured into a capable officer, trusted by both peers and superiors. Sarah's support networks demonstrated the essential role of home front contributions, while Samuel's meticulous records ensured that the stories of ordinary heroes were preserved. The Whitfields' experiences in the South underscored the interconnected nature of the immense revolution. Victories in one region depended on courage, resourcefulness, and solidarity across the colonies. As the year drew to a close, the Southern colonies remained contested, but the efforts of the Whitfields and other militias had demonstrated the viability of persistent resistance. Guerrilla tactics, local knowledge, and coordination with larger continental forces allowed Patriot units to survive, regroup, and continue the fight. The revolution, once concentrated in the North, had become a truly continental struggle, requiring adaptability, determination, and unwavering commitment to the cause of independence. The Whitfields returned north briefly at the end of 1779, weary but undaunted, carrying the lessons of Southern warfare. They had witnessed the harsh realities of civil conflict, navigated treacherous terrain, and engaged in battles that tested every skill and virtue. Yet their resolve remained unbroken, their commitment to liberty stronger than ever. They had endured the fires of combat and emerged wiser, more capable, and ready for the next phase of the struggle. Part 14. The Turning Tide. Yorktown and French Alliance 17801-781. By 1780. The American Revolution had entered a critical phase. After years of grueling campaigns in the North and South, the struggle had tested every colony, every community, and every family. For the Whitfields, the previous years of combat, hardship, and sacrifice had forged them into a family intimately connected to the cause. John Whitfield's leadership, Thomas's growing command abilities, Sarah's tireless support, and Samuel's meticulous chronicling all contributed to the war effort in ways that would leave lasting impact. The strategic situation had shifted in the colonies. The French alliance, formalized in 1778, had begun to bear fruit. French troops and naval support provided vital reinforcements, supplies, and the promise of international legitimacy. For John and Thomas Whitfield, this new dimension of warfare demanded coordination, communication, and careful planning. French officers trained alongside Continental units, sharing tactics and knowledge that would prove decisive in upcoming campaigns. In 1780, the Southern theater remained contested. British General Cornwallis had established strong positions in the Carolinas and Virginia. Relying on Loyalist support and fortified towns to consolidate control, the Whitfields, returning to active service after a brief respite in Massachusetts, joined militia units moving south to harass supply lines, gather intelligence, and coordinate with Continental forces. Guerrilla tactics learned in earlier Southern campaigns remained essential. John Whitfield led reconnaissance missions along rivers and wooded trails, while Thomas commanded smaller detachments that executed precise raids against enemy convoys and patrols. Their experiences from previous campaigns made them invaluable in navigating both terrain and shifting loyalties among civilians. Meanwhile, Samuel Whitfield's writings continued to circulate widely. His detailed accounts of previous battles, the Southern campaigns, and the harsh winters of Valley Forge provided inspiration and practical knowledge. Townspeople, militias, and even Continental officers consulted his chronicles to understand patterns of movement, potential ambush points, and strategies for sustaining forces during extended operations. Sarah Whitfield's correspondence ensured that soldiers in the field remained connected to home, reinforcing morale and sustaining the vital networks that made prolonged campaigns possible. The climactic moment arrived in 1781 when British forces under Cornwallis moved into Yorktown, Virginia, establishing a fortified position on the Chesapeake Peninsula. General George Washington, along with French General Rochambeau and their combined forces, planned a coordinated assault that would finally bring the British to decisive engagement. John Whitfield and Thomas, part of the supporting militia units, was prepared for rapid movement and logistical support, aware that this campaign could end years of relentless conflict. As the Allied forces approached Yorktown, the Whitfields witnessed the careful planning and precision required for large-scale operations. Supply lines were secured, artillery positioned, and coordination with French naval units ensured that escape by sea would be cut off. The siege began in earnest, and for weeks, troops worked tirelessly to construct trenches, move artillery, and maintain readiness under the constant threat of enemy sorties. John Whitfield supervised engineering efforts, while Thomas led reconnaissance missions to identify weak points in British defenses. The Whitfields' prior experience in both northern sieges and southern guerrilla tactics proved invaluable. The siege tested endurance and patience. Soldiers dug under fire, artillery crews labored in mud and rain, and officers coordinated movements with exacting attention. The Whitfields endured long days and nights, witnessing both the horrors of war and the quiet heroism of ordinary men performing extraordinary tasks. Disease and fatigue were constant companions, yet the presence of allies and the growing realization that victory might be near bolstered spirits. Samuel Whitfield's meticulous notes captured the blend of hardship and hope, preserving the details for posterity. On October 14, 1781, the final assaults began. Artillery bombarded British positions, infantry advanced under cover, and the coordination between French and American forces proved decisive. John Whitfield led his men in a daring advance to secure critical redoubts, facing musket fire, obstacles, and entrenched defenders. Thomas, demonstrating remarkable leadership, commanded a flanking maneuver that disrupted enemy lines and facilitated the main assault. The fighting was fierce, yet precise coordination and relentless pressure gradually eroded British defenses. After weeks of siege, Cornwallis recognized the futility of continued resistance. On October 19, 1781, British forces formally surrendered at Yorktown. For the Whitfields, the moment was overwhelming. Years of struggle, sacrifice, and perseverance had culminated in a decisive victory. John Whitfield felt a profound mix of relief and exhaustion, while Thomas's pride and joy were tempered by the memory of comrades lost along the way. Sarah Whitfield, having traveled to Virginia with support networks, witnessed the surrender and embraced her family, tears flowing freely. Samuel, chronicling the event in meticulous detail, captured not only the military significance, but the human emotions that defined this pivotal moment. The victory at Yorktown marked a turning point. While skirmishes and negotiations continued, the war was effectively decided. British forces recognized that sustaining control over the colonies was no longer feasible. The path to independence became clear. The Whitfields, having endured battles in Massachusetts, the southern colonies, the crucible of Valley Forge, had played an active role in shaping this outcome. Their leadership, courage, and resilience embodied the larger struggle of the American people. In the months following Yorktown, the Whitfields returned home, carrying both the physical scars of battle and the enduring memories of comradeship, hardship, and triumph. Communities celebrated, yet the reality of reconstruction, political organization, and healing remained. The Whitfields participated in rebuilding efforts, supporting local governance, and documenting the experiences of ordinary soldiers and civilians whose contributions had ensured victory. Samuel Whitfield's writings, already influential, became a cornerstone for understanding the Revolution from the perspective of those who lived it. The Whitfields' journey through the Southern campaigns in Yorktown exemplified the interconnectedness of strategy, courage, and endurance. John's command, Thomas's tactical skill, Sarah's unwavering support, and Samuel's chronicling all contributed to a broader narrative of resilience and achievement. The Revolution, long and arduous, had forged new leaders, strengthened communities, and ultimately secured the birth of a nation dedicated to the principles of liberty and self-governance. By the close of 1781, the war's major hostilities had ended, but the Whitfields remained vigilant. Their experiences had prepared them to help shape the new nation, ensuring that the sacrifices made would not be forgotten and that the ideals for which they had fought would endure. The turning tide at Yorktown had demonstrated that unity, perseverance, and courage could overcome even the most formidable adversaries, and the Whitfield's legacy would be intertwined with the triumph of a fledgling America. Part 15. Peace Negotiations and Treaty of Paris, 1782 to 1783. The final chapters of the American Revolution were marked not by cannon fire and musket volleys, but by diplomacy, negotiation, and the painstaking work of turning hard-won battlefield victories into lasting independence. For the Whitfields, the years of sacrifice and hardship had prepared them to witness, and in some ways participate in, the birth of a nation. Their journey from the cold trenches of Boston to the guerrilla campaigns in the southern colonies, from the bitter winter of Valley Forge to the decisive victory at Yorktown, culminated in the promise of peace and self-governance. By 1782, British forces had begun withdrawing from positions across the colonies. The once formidable army, defeated in key battles and facing political pressure at home, sought to negotiate terms that would minimize further losses. John Whitfield, now a veteran commander, continued to oversee the demobilization of local militia and the secure return of troops to their homes. Thomas, with growing experience in leadership and administration, assisted in managing supply redistribution and communications between various units. Sarah Whitfield coordinated support for returning soldiers and their families, providing clothing, food, and medical assistance to those who bore the scars of years of conflict. Across the Atlantic, American representatives in Paris engaged in delicate negotiations with British officials. Figures such as John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin worked tirelessly to secure terms favorable to the fledgling United States. Samuel Whitfield, chronicling these events for public record, documented not only the debates and discussions, but also the hopes, fears, and ambitions of the negotiators. The Whitfields understood that military victories alone were insufficient. Diplomacy would determine whether the ideals fought for on the battlefield would endure in law, governance, and practice. In November 1782, preliminary agreements signaled a breakthrough. Britain recognized the need to acknowledge American sovereignty, agree to territorial boundaries, and address issues such as the repayment of debts and the protection of loyalists. While skirmishes and tensions persisted in isolated regions, the general sense among patriot leaders and families was one of cautious optimism. John Whitfield oversaw the secure return of weaponry and supplies, ensuring that the transition from war to peace was orderly and that local communities could begin rebuilding. Thomas assisted with record-keeping, logistics, and coordination with state militias, understanding that the end of active combat did not mean the immediate restoration of normalcy. The formal Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783. Britain recognized the United States as a free, sovereign nation and established borders stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, from Canada to the northern boundary of Florida. For the Whitfields, the treaty represented the culmination of years of sacrifice, struggle, and perseverance. Families across the colonies celebrated in towns, fields, and city streets. Bells rang, flags were raised, and speeches proclaimed the dawn of a new era. John Whitfield allowed himself a rare moment of reflection, recalling the friends lost, the winters endured, and the battles fought. Thomas, standing beside him, felt pride in both personal achievement and collective victory. Sarah's tears of relief and joy mirrored the emotions of countless women whose labor, courage, and steadfastness had sustained the war effort. The post-war period brought its own challenges. Returning soldiers faced reintegration into civilian life. Disputes over land and compensation arose, and communities worked to recover economically from years of disruption. The Whitfields applied their experience to these tasks, helping to mediate local disputes, provide guidance to returning veterans, and support rebuilding efforts. Samuel Whitfield continued his writings, documenting both the celebrations and the struggles of peacetime, ensuring that the story of the Revolution would be remembered not just as a military campaign, but as a transformative social and political event. Education and civic responsibility became central themes in the Whitfield's post-war life. John emphasized the importance of civic engagement, encouraging participation in local governance and the establishment of institutions that would uphold the ideals for which they had fought. Thomas, influenced by both military discipline and practical leadership experience, took an active role in mentoring younger men, preparing the next generation to defend and sustain the freedoms gained. Sarah's work in community welfare expanded to include education for children, care for the poor, and ongoing support for widows and families of fallen soldiers. The Whitfield story also reflected broader societal shifts. The revolution had challenged traditional hierarchies, empowered ordinary citizens, and sparked debates about liberty, equality, and governance. John and Thomas engaged in discussions about the formation of state constitutions, the balance of power between local and national authorities, and the responsibilities of citizens in a republic. Samuel's writings captured these dialogues, illustrating how the ideals of independence were interpreted, debated, and implemented at the grassroots level. By the end of 1783, the United States of America had emerged as a recognized nation, poised to define its identity and place in the world. The Whitfields, having participated in every stage of the Revolution from the earliest skirmishes to the decisive victory at Yorktown and the signing of the Treaty of Paris, stood as a testament to resilience, courage, and unwavering commitment to liberty. Their experiences encapsulated the struggles of countless families whose sacrifices had made independence possible. In the years that followed, the Whitfields continued to shape their communities. John returned to agricultural and civic leadership, applying lessons learned in strategy and management to local governance. Thomas pursued opportunities in public service and military organization, mentoring younger officers and ensuring that the knowledge gained through years of conflict was preserved. Sarah Whitfield expanded her philanthropic efforts, championing education, health, and the welfare of families affected by war. Samuel's chronicles became an invaluable record of the Revolution, blending detailed accounts of battles, diplomacy, and daily life with reflections on courage, sacrifice, and the pursuit of liberty. The Treaty of Paris marked not merely the end of hostilities, but the beginning of a new chapter. The Whitfields, like the nation they helped to create, faced the task of turning revolutionary ideals into lasting institutions, shaping a society where freedom, responsibility, and civic virtue could flourish. Their legacy, forged in the crucible of war, would endure as both a personal testament and a reflection of the broader American experience. Through victory, hardship, and the triumph of diplomacy, the Whitfields had come full circle from citizens under colonial rule to active participants in the founding of an independent nation. The Revolution had tested their limits, defined their character, and bound them together in purpose. As the United States began its journey into sovereignty, the Whitfields stood among those whose courage, resilience, and unwavering dedication ensured that liberty would endure, and whose story would inspire generations to come. Part 16, Nation Building and Challenges of Early America, 1783 to 1787. The guns had fallen silent, smoke of battle dispersed, and the colonies had emerged as the independent United States of America. Yet the end of the Revolution did not bring immediate peace or prosperity. Like countless other families, the challenge now was to help construct a nation from the fragile threads of war, ambition, and hope. The task was immense, creating stable governance, rebuilding economies, defining the values and principles that would guide the fledgling republic. John Whitfield, seasoned by years of leadership and service, turned his attention to local governance. Communities across Massachusetts faced shortages of food, unstable trade, and legal disputes arising from property and debts unsettled during the war. John's experience in organizing militias and coordinating logistics proved invaluable in civil administration. He helped mediate land disputes, assisted veterans in securing compensation, and worked with town committees to establish orderly taxation and law enforcement. His reputation as a fair and decisive leader, earned on the battlefield, now extended into civic life. Thomas Whitfield, emboldened by his military experience, embraced opportunities in public service and local politics. He understood that the liberties won through blood and sacrifice would only endure if supported by laws, institutions, and civic engagement. Thomas attended town meetings, contributed to drafting local regulations, and encouraged young men in the community to participate in governance. His guidance emphasized accountability, fairness, and the preservation of freedom, reflecting the hard-won lessons of the Revolution. Sarah Whitfield's work took on new dimensions in peacetime. She organized community education initiatives, helping establish schools and literacy programs for children and adults alike. She also extended support to widows, orphans, and families left destitute by the war, recognizing that liberty was inseparable from social responsibility. Her leadership created networks of care that strengthened communal bonds and ensured that the sacrifices of the revolution would not be forgotten. The Whitfields also faced economic challenges. The war had disrupted trade, decimated crops, and left communities dependent on scarce resources. John led efforts to restore agriculture, organize local markets, and encourage cooperative ventures among farmers. Thomas promoted entrepreneurship and the rebuilding of small-scale industries, emphasizing the importance of self-sufficiency and local resilience. Their efforts contributed not only to family survival, but to the broader economic recovery of the region. At the national level, debates raged over the structure and authority of the new government. The Articles of Confederation, adopted during the war, proved inadequate in providing stability and coordinating policies across the states. John and Thomas Whitfield followed these debates closely, understanding that the success of the revolution depended not just on independence, but on the creation of functional institutions. Town meetings, local councils, and state conventions became arenas for discussion, compromise, and planning, and the Whitfields were active participants in shaping policy and civic norms. Samuel Whitfield continued to chronicle these developments with the same diligence that had marked his wartime writings. His records preserve debates over taxation, representation, and the balance of powers, capturing both the ideas and personalities shaping early American governance. He highlighted the tension between freedom and order, individual rights and communal responsibilities, illustrating that the work of nation-building demanded patience, negotiation, and principled leadership. The period also highlighted the fragility of unity. States and communities often disagreed over economic policies, trade regulations, and the role of central authority. John and Thomas participated in dialogues aimed at reconciling these differences, emphasizing compromise and practical solutions. They understood that the lessons of war cooperation, discipline, shared purpose were essential for political and social cohesion in peacetime. The Whitfields' personal experiences mirrored national challenges. Returning soldiers struggled to reintegrate, local economies required restructuring, and communities worked to heal divisions exacerbated by wartime loyalties. John facilitated veteran support networks, Thomas assisted with legal disputes and civic education, and Sarah oversaw initiatives to provide social stability. Their combined efforts reinforced the principle that liberty required active participation, mutual aid, and sustained effort beyond the battlefield. By 1787, momentum toward a stronger national government was building. The Constitutional Convention convened in Philadelphia, bringing together leaders to address the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation and create a framework for governance that could sustain the new nation. The Whitfields followed these developments with intense interest, recognizing that the decisions made in Philadelphia would shape the trajectory of the United States for generations. John and Thomas engaged in discussions within their community, explaining proposed structures, debating representation, and encouraging civic awareness. Sarah and Samuel provided commentary and recorded perspectives, ensuring that ordinary citizens could engage with ideas often discussed only in elite circles. The Whitfields' engagement in nation-building illustrated the interplay between local and national responsibilities. They understood that independence was not a conclusion but a beginning, a call to create, govern, and sustain a society based on principles fought for at great cost. Through their efforts, they bridged the experiences of war with the challenges of peace, applying the values of courage, discipline, and cooperation to civic life. Education, public service, and ethical leadership became guiding principles for the Whitfields. John continued to mentor local leaders. Thomas promoted structured civic participation. Sarah expanded welfare and educational initiatives. And Samuel ensured that historical records preserve lessons for future generations. Their story reflected the broader reality of early America. Independence required not just military success, but active engagement in governance, social responsibility, and economic rebuilding. By the close of 1787, the Constitution had been drafted, setting forth a new framework for national governance. The Whitfields celebrated the accomplishment while remaining vigilant, They understood that the work of a free nation was ongoing, demanding both commitment and sacrifice from all citizens. Their experiences in battlefields and encampments, and within communities, provided a foundation for active, informed participation in shaping the future. The Whitfields emerged from the early years of the Republic as a family emblematic of the Revolution's enduring legacy. Their leadership, resilience, and dedication helped transform abstract ideals into practical governance, demonstrating that liberty required action, vigilance, and collective responsibility in shaping their communities, supporting returning soldiers, and contributing to political discourse. They played a vital role in ensuring that the sacrifices of the revolution translated into lasting institutions and a society capable of sustaining freedom. Part 17: Westward Expansion in Frontier Life, 1787-1790, with the Constitution drafted and ratified. The United States began charting its course as a sovereign nation. Yet independence did not mean security or comfort for all citizens. The land beyond the eastern settlements beckoned, promising opportunity, resources, and freedom, but also danger. For the Whitfields, this period marked a new chapter, one of exploration, settlement, and adaptation to life on the frontier. John Whitfield, now an experienced leader both in war and civic affairs, recognized the potential of lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. Ports of fertile valleys, rich forests, and navigable rivers inspired many families to seek new opportunities. The Whitfields prepared carefully, gathering supplies, tools, and livestock, understanding that survival on the frontier demanded skill, resilience, and foresight. Thomas, experienced in military campaigns and logistics, led the planning of the journey, ensuring routes were safe and provisions adequate. Sarah Whitfield, ever resourceful, organized the household's needs, including medical supplies, seeds for planting, and educational materials for their children. The journey west was arduous. Roads were primitive, rivers required careful navigation, and forests were dense with unfamiliar wildlife. The Whitfields traveled with wagons loaded with tools, food, and household goods, moving cautiously to avoid accidents and hostile encounters. Along the way, they met other families seeking new beginnings, creating temporary settlements that combined mutual aid with vigilance. Scouts and guides became essential, and Thomas's knowledge of terrain, survival, and military discipline proved invaluable in maintaining safety and morale. Life on the frontier tested every skill the Whitfields had acquired during the Revolution. Homes had to be built quickly using local timber, fields cleared for crops, and fences erected to protect livestock. John oversaw construction, applying lessons learned in fortification and organization from his military service. Thomas assisted in surveying the land, planning fields, and establishing security measures against both wildlife and potential hostile encounters. Sarah, managing the domestic sphere, ensured the household functioned smoothly, teaching children, preparing food, and organizing community support networks among neighboring settlers. The frontier was both beautiful and perilous. Dense forests, rushing rivers, and rolling hills provided abundance, but also hidden dangers. Encounters with wildlife, bears, wolves, and venomous snakes were common. Additionally, tensions occasionally arose with Native American tribes defending their ancestral lands. The Whitfields, guided by experience and prudence, sought to maintain peaceful relations, trading goods and respecting established boundaries while remaining vigilant for potential conflicts. These interactions highlighted the complexities of expansion, requiring diplomacy, caution, and understanding of local cultures. Agriculture became the foundation of frontier life. John and Thomas worked tirelessly to clear fields, plant crops, and ensure the survival of livestock. They experimented with crops suited to the new climate and soil, learning through trial, error, and advice from other settlers. Food security was a constant concern, particularly during harsh winters and droughts. Yet every successful harvest reinforced the Whitfields' determination and validated their choice to seek opportunity in the frontier lands. The community played a critical role in survival and prosperity. Families banded together to construct schools, share tools, and provide mutual protection. Sarah Whitfield spearheaded initiatives to teach children basic literacy, arithmetic, and practical skills necessary for survival. She also organized networks to care for the sick, distribute food during shortages, and ensure that communal bonds remained strong. John and Thomas coordinated defenses and communal labor, understanding that unity was essential for enduring the trials of frontier life. In addition to physical challenges, the frontier demanded adaptability and resourcefulness. The Whitfields learned to hunt, fish, and forage efficiently. They mastered the construction of wells, rudimentary irrigation systems, and smokehouses for preserving food. Thomas applied strategic thinking honed in wartime to manage resources, plan labor schedules, and anticipate seasonal challenges. John's leadership ensured that every family member had a role, contributing to both survival and community cohesion. Social and civic life gradually developed in the frontier settlements. Town meetings, religious gatherings, and community projects became central to daily life. The Whitfields participated actively, drawing on their experiences from Massachusetts to establish governance structures, mediate disputes, and ensure fairness. Their reputation for leadership and reliability earned them respect and influence among neighboring families. Samuel Whitfield documented these early settlements, capturing the rhythms, hardships, and innovations of frontier life, preserving the story for future generations. The Whitfields also witnessed the broader political changes of the early republic as they expanded westward. Land policies, treaties with Native American tribes, and state and federal regulations affected settlement patterns, resource allocation, and community development. John and Thomas engaged with officials, advocated for fair practices, and ensured that settlers' voices were represented. Their experience in governance, negotiation, and community organization provided crucial guidance during this formative period. By 1790, the Whitfields had established a thriving homestead on the frontier. Fields produced food, livestock prospered, and the family contributed to a growing cooperative settlement. They had endured harsh winters, navigated unknown terrain, and built a life from raw land and determination. Their experiences reflected the broader expansion of the United States, illustrating the challenges, opportunities, and responsibilities inherent in shaping a nation through exploration and settlement. The Whitfields' frontier life highlighted the continuity of the principles fought for during the Revolution. Liberty, self-reliance, cooperation, and civic responsibility remained guiding values. The hardships of war had prepared them for the demands of westward expansion, while their commitment to community, education, and ethical leadership ensured that their frontier settlement would flourish. Samuel Whitfield's chronicles captured the triumphs and struggles, emphasizing that the story of America's growth was as much about ordinary families building homes as it was about battles and treaties. The Whitfields' experiences on the frontier reflected the broader narrative of the early republic. Freedom offered opportunity, but it demanded courage, resilience, and collaboration. Through hard work, leadership, and perseverance, the family not only survived, but thrived, contributing to the formation of communities, cultivation of land, and the enduring promise of the American dream. Part 18. Political Engagement and the First Presidency, 1790-1797. As the 1790s dawned, the United States entered a new phase. The Revolutionary War was behind them. The Constitution had been ratified, and the fledgling nation was now governed under a unified federal system, yet building a functioning democracy, balancing state and national interests, and maintaining public trust presented formidable challenges. For the Whitfields, this period offered opportunities to apply their hard-won experience in leadership, governance, and civic responsibility to the shaping of American political life. John Whitfield, seasoned by both battlefield command and post-war civic engagement, took an active role in local and regional politics. He understood that independence required vigilance, not only to protect liberty, but also to ensure that the government remained accountable, effective, and responsive to citizens' needs. John attended town councils, participated in state conventions, and served as a mediator in disputes involving land, commerce, and local taxation. His reputation for fairness and practical judgment earned during years of military and civil service made him a respected voice in these deliberations. Thomas Whitfield, building on his experience from the Revolution and frontier life, increasingly engaged in regional political affairs. He studied emerging legislation, followed congressional debates, and advised community leaders on the implications of federal policies. Dennis encouraged younger settlers to participate in elections, engage with government officials, and understand their responsibilities as citizens of a republic. His emphasis on informed civic participation reflected the lessons of the Revolution that freedom was inseparable from active engagement and accountability. Sarah Whitfield, recognizing that political engagement extended beyond the ballot, focused on community education and social welfare. She established discussion groups to inform citizens about laws, taxation, and the Constitution, while continuing her initiatives in schools, literacy, and welfare, connecting households and communities to the political process. Sarah ensured that ordinary citizens could exercise their rights knowledgeably and effectively, reinforcing the foundations of democratic governance. The Whitfields also observed the presidency of George Washington with deep interest and respect. Washington, as the first president, faced the delicate task of balancing national unity with regional differences, establishing precedents for governance and guiding the young nation through internal and external pressures. John and Thomas followed Washington's policies on fiscal management, foreign relations, and domestic security. Evaluating how these decisions impacted local communities, trade, and social cohesion, they discussed these policies at town meetings, advising neighbors on adaptation and compliance. While emphasizing the importance of civic support for national institutions, economic policies, particularly those introduced by Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, became focal points of discussion in the Whitfields community. The federal assumption of state debts, creation of a national bank, and establishment of tariffs generated both support and opposition. John and Thomas worked to explain the rationale behind these policies, highlighting the need for financial stability and the long-term benefits of a unified economy. Their pragmatic approach helped bridge divisions among settlers, balancing skepticism with informed engagement. Meanwhile, foreign policy continued to influence domestic life. Conflicts between Britain and France, and the need to navigate neutrality, required citizens to understand international dynamics and their implications for trade and security. The Whitfields maintained correspondence with relatives and neighbors, disseminating accurate information, analyzing treaties, and encouraging rational discussion about national interests. Their commitment to civic education reinforced the principle that informed citizens were essential to sustaining a stable and independent republic. In addition to these national issues, the Whitfields focused on local governance and law enforcement. John served on committees addressing property disputes, militia organization, and community infrastructure. Thomas assisted with public safety measures, ensuring roads, bridges, and public buildings were maintained, and overseeing the coordination of local militias in case of emergencies. Their combined efforts illustrated that effective governance required attention to both macro-level policy and the practical needs of communities. The Whitfields also observed the emergence of political factions, Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and the debates surrounding the balance of power between federal and state authorities. John and Thomas encouraged open dialogue within the community, emphasizing respect for differing opinions while advocating for compromise and consensus. Their approach reflected the lessons of the Revolution, that unity and shared purpose were essential to preserving liberty. Even amid disagreement, social and civic life flourished alongside political engagement. The Whitfields organized town meetings, public lectures, and in circles to foster discussion on law, governance, and citizenship. Sarah's educational initiatives ensured that children and adults alike could understand their rights and responsibilities. Samuel Whitfield continued his chronicles, recording the evolving political landscape, civic debates, and the practical challenges of implementing democratic principles in newly established communities. The presidency of George Washington, though peaceful, was marked by critical decisions that set precedents for the nation. The Whitfields followed events such as the Whiskey Rebellion, which tested federal authority, and the negotiation of treaties with Native American tribes and foreign powers. John and Thomas applied these lessons locally, helping to maintain law and order, mediate conflicts, and promote respect for legal authority. Their guidance ensured that frontier and settled communities aligned with national policies while preserving their autonomy and traditions. By 1797, as Washington prepared to leave office and set the precedent for peaceful transfer of power, The Whitfields had fully integrated into the civic and political life of the new republic. Their contributions through governance, education, community organization, and chronicling history illustrated the essential role of engaged citizens in sustaining the ideals of independence. The family had transitioned from wartime leadership to peacetime stewardship, demonstrating that the principles of liberty demanded constant participation and vigilance. The Whitfields' engagement during this period highlighted the interplay between national policy and local experience. Their understanding of governance, leadership, and civic responsibility allowed them to guide their community through economic, political, and social changes. They bridged the gap between the abstract ideals of the Constitution and the practical realities of daily life, ensuring that the young republic could thrive. Education, social welfare, and civic involvement became central pillars of the Whitfields' legacy. John's leadership in governance, Thomas's mentorship of emerging leaders, Sarah's initiatives in education and welfare, and Samuel's meticulous chronicles preserved the lessons of the era for future generations. Their story reflected the broader narrative of early America, that freedom was not simply granted but maintained. Through knowledge, responsibility, and active participation in civic life. By the close of Washington's presidency, the United States had established a framework for governance, set precedents for peaceful transitions, and begun consolidating national unity. The Whitfields, having lived through revolution, settlement, and political formation, embodied the continuity between sacrifice, civic engagement, and the enduring promise of liberty. Their experiences demonstrated that building a nation required more than military victory. It demanded informed citizens, ethical leadership, and commitment to the public good. Part 19. Economic Growth and Expansion of Influence 1797-1800. As the 18th century drew to a close, the United States faced the challenge of turning political independence into economic stability. The foundations laid during the Revolution and the early years of the Republic provided a platform, but opportunity and prosperity required vision, initiative, and determination. For the Whitfields, this period marked a time of expanding influence, entrepreneurship, and shaping both local and regional economies, building on the principles of hard work, discipline, and civic responsibility instilled over decades of experience. John Whitfield, now a respected elder in his community, focused on agricultural innovation and trade, recognizing that the prosperity of the region depended on both production and distribution. He oversaw the introduction of new crops, improved farming techniques, and organized cooperative networks among local farmers. John encouraged diversification, integrating grain, livestock, and orchard cultivation to reduce risk and ensure food security. He also promoted local markets, facilitating trade with neighboring settlements and establishing relationships with merchants and buyers in nearby towns and ports. Thomas Whitfield, combining his military logistics experience with entrepreneurial ambition, expanded the family's commercial reach. He supervised the construction of rudimentary roads and bridges, improving access to markets and enabling efficient transport of goods. He negotiated contracts for the sale of agricultural produce and surplus supplies, fostering trade networks that extended beyond the immediate region. Thomas also encouraged the establishment of small-scale artisan workshops, supporting blacksmiths, carpenters, and weavers, providing both employment and essential services to settlers in the growing frontier communities. Sarah Whitfield's contributions remained central to the cohesion and prosperity of the Whitfields' enterprises. She oversaw the management of household production, including preservation of food, textile work, and education of younger family members. Additionally, she organized social networks and cooperatives among women in the community, enabling shared labor, mutual assistance, and the exchange of skills. These efforts strengthened both the economic and social fabric of frontier settlements, ensuring that prosperity was widely shared and sustainable. The Whitfields' influence extended into public works and infrastructure development. John and Thomas collaborated with local authorities to improve roads, bridges, and public buildings, recognizing that connectivity and organization were essential to economic growth. They also advised on the establishment of warehouses, grain storage facilities, and rudimentary port infrastructure, ensuring that trade could flourish even in previously isolated regions. Their efforts helped transform frontier settlements into thriving. self-sustaining communities capable of supporting growth and attracting new settlers. Commerce was increasingly shaped by national policies and international developments. The United States' neutrality in European conflicts allowed trade to continue. But tensions with Britain and France occasionally disrupted shipping and markets. The Whitfields adapted, finding alternative routes, negotiating local exchanges, and cultivating self-reliance through increased production and storage. Their ability to navigate uncertainty reflected lessons learned from both wartime strategy and frontier resilience, emphasizing adaptability and foresight. Education and skill building became essential components of economic growth. Sarah ensured that children learned not only literacy and numeracy, but practical skills such as bookkeeping, farming, and crafts. Thomas organized apprenticeships for young men in trades and logistics, ensuring that local labor forces were capable, versatile, and prepared to sustain community development. John, applying his experience in organization and leadership, mentored both settlers and local officials in economic planning, governance, and civic responsibility. The Whitfields also recognized the importance of ethical conduct in commerce. John and Thomas emphasized fair pricing, honesty in trade, and respect for contracts, understanding that trust was the foundation of sustainable economic relationships. Sarah promoted fairness in household and communal labor exchanges, reinforcing social cohesion and the equitable distribution of resources. Samuel Whitfield documented these practices, noting how ethics, diligence, and cooperation enabled frontier communities to flourish despite limited infrastructure and resources. By the late 1790s, the Whitfields' influence extended beyond economics. They were regarded as community leaders, advisors, and educators. Bridging the gap between local initiatives and regional developments, their homestead became a hub for discussions on trade, governance, education, and community welfare. Town meetings, workshops, and public lectures facilitated dialogue among settlers, ensuring that progress was guided by both practical needs and moral principles. National events continued to shape local conditions. The peaceful transition of the presidency from Washington to John Adams in 1797 reinforced confidence in American governance, while policies on tariffs, taxation, and trade influenced local economies. The Whitfields engaged actively with these developments, interpreting federal decisions for their community, advocating for fair implementation, and ensuring that settlers could benefit from opportunities while minimizing risks. Their engagement illustrated the interplay between national policy and local initiative, demonstrating how active citizenship contributed to both governance and prosperity. The Whitfields' approach to expansion combined opportunity with responsibility. While they sought economic growth, they also prioritized sustainability, community welfare, and education. Their leadership ensured that settlements could endure seasonal challenges, market fluctuations, and occasional conflicts, creating resilience that would support future generations. Samuel's chronicles highlighted how entrepreneurship, civic engagement, and ethical conduct intersected to create thriving communities in early America. By 1800, the Whitfields had established a legacy of economic influence, community leadership, and civic responsibility. John's guidance in agriculture and trade, Thomas's infrastructure and commercial initiatives, Sarah's social and educational programs, and Samuel's historical record-keeping reflected a holistic approach to development. Their contributions ensured that frontier settlements evolved into stable, prosperous communities capable of participating in the broader national economy. The period of 1797 to 1800 demonstrated that the Revolution's promise extended beyond political independence. Economic growth, infrastructure, and social cohesion were equally essential to building a strong nation. The Whitfields exemplified this principle, showing how leadership, skill, and ethical conduct could transform opportunity into tangible, enduring progress. Their story reflected the broader evolution of the United States at the century's close, a young nation asserting its independence, cultivating prosperity, and laying the foundations for sustained growth and influence. Part 20. Legacy and Reflections on a Nation's Birth, 1800 to 1805. As the new century began, the United States stood at a crossroads. Independence, hard won through decades of struggle, was no longer an abstract ideal, but a tangible reality. The institutions, communities, and governance structures established in the wake of the Revolution and the early years of the Republic now faced the challenge of continuity, adaptation, and growth. For the Whitfields, the period from 1800 to 1805 was one of reflection, consolidation, and the acknowledgement of a legacy forged through courage, sacrifice, and tireless dedication to both family and nation. John Whitfield, now an elder statesman in his community, spent these years reflecting on the journey that had begun decades earlier in the towns and forests of Massachusetts. From the first sparks of rebellion to the decisive victories of Yorktown, from the trials of frontier life to active engagement in civic affairs, he saw a continuum of service and responsibility. John's work in agriculture, local governance, and community building had not only ensured the survival and prosperity of his own family, but also contributed to the foundations of thriving settlements that would endure for generations. He frequently gathered with neighbors and friends, recounting the lessons of leadership, perseverance, and the importance of ethical conduct, ensuring that the stories of courage and resilience were preserved not only in Samuel's chronicles, but in the living memory of the community. Thomas Whitfield, whose life had been shaped by both the battlefield and the frontier, reflected on the practical applications of his experiences. He recognized that the freedoms gained through war and diplomacy carried responsibilities that extended far beyond the immediate concerns of survival. Through his efforts in trade, infrastructure, and mentorship, Thomas had helped transform isolated settlements into interconnected communities capable of self-governance, economic sustainability, and social cohesion. His guidance of younger settlers and local officials exemplified the principle that leadership was as much about education and empowerment as it was about authority or decision-making. Sarah Whitfield's contributions to the family legacy were no less profound. Throughout decades of upheaval and change, she had maintained the cohesion, welfare, and moral compass of her household and community. By organizing educational initiatives, providing social support, fostering networks of mutual assistance among settlers, Sarah ensured that the ideals of the Revolution of Liberty, responsibility, and civic engagement were embedded in the next generation. Her tireless work demonstrated that the building of a nation required both public action and the nurturing of its citizens' minds and hearts. Samuel Whitfield, chronicler of the family and the era, continued to document the unfolding story of the young republic. His writings captured the triumphs, trials, and transformations of the past decades, blending military history, political developments, economic growth, and social life into a comprehensive record. Samuel recognized that the legacy of the Revolution was not confined to the battlefield, but lived in the institutions, communities, and values that the Whitfields and their contemporaries had helped establish. His chronicles became a vital testament to the lived experience of early America, preserving the insights and lessons of an entire generation. The nation itself reflected the evolution witnessed by the Whitfields. The peaceful transfer of power to Thomas Jefferson in 1801, the continued expansion of settlements, and the gradual stabilization of political and economic institutions signaled both progress and the challenges ahead. The Whitfields remained engaged, advising communities, mentoring leaders, and applying the principles of practical wisdom, civic responsibility, and ethical governance that had guided them through decades of upheaval. They understood that liberty, once won, required continuous stewardship. The Whitfields' reflection on their own family story highlighted the interconnectedness of personal sacrifice and national development. John's leadership, Thomas's initiative, Sarah's nurturing guidance, and Samuel's historical preservation were all threads woven into the larger fabric of the nation. Each member's contributions, whether on battlefields, in councils, on the frontier, or within homes, illustrated the multifaceted effort required to sustain a republic. Their experiences embodied the principle that freedom was inseparable from responsibility, courage from compassion, and independence from community. By 1805, the Whitfields had become emblematic of the generational impact of the Revolution. Their children, educated, capable, and socially engaged, carried forward the family legacy, contributing to civic life, economic growth, and the cultivation of culture and values in emerging communities. The Whitfields' homestead, once a frontier settlement, had transformed into a thriving hub of commerce, education, and governance, illustrating the tangible results of decades of labor, vision, and perseverance. The family also reflected on the broader moral and philosophical lessons of their era. They understood that liberty demanded vigilance, that prosperity required fairness and foresight, and that community strength depended on both individual responsibility and collective cooperation. These principles, cultivated through war, settlement, and civic engagement, had guided the Whitfields through every challenge, from the uncertainties of early rebellion to the complexities of nation-building. The Whitfield story served as a bridge between generations, connecting the revolutionary ideals of the 1770s and 1780s to the practical realities of a functioning republic in the early 19th century. John, Thomas, Sarah, and Samuel all recognized that their experiences were part of a continuum, one that extended beyond their own lives to the countless individuals and communities that would shape the nation's future. Their efforts in leadership, education, infrastructure, commerce, and historical preservation ensured that the lessons of independence would endure. In conclusion, the Whitfields' journey from colonial subjects to architects of community and nationhood exemplified the broader American experience. Through courage, resilience, and unwavering commitment, they had navigated the complexities of war, peace, expansion, and governance. Their legacy was not only the tangible contributions to settlements, commerce, and institutions, but also the intangible lessons of perseverance, ethical leadership, and civic responsibility. As the United States moved forward into the 19th century, the Whitfields' story stood as a testament to the enduring power of family, community, and nation, a reflection of the sacrifices, triumphs, and vision that forged a country and inspired generations to come.